right, let's get started. Welcome to the 20th International Wildlife Law Conference. I'm Roy Gardner, Professor of Law and Director of the Institute for Biodiversity Law and Policy at Stetson University College of Law, and I very much appreciate your joining us today. Obviously, we had been planning to hold an in-person conference. Events have required us to move to an online format. Thanks to the participants, both the speakers and the attendees, for being so accommodating as we move to this format, and we also appreciate your patience if we run into a few technical challenges along the way. We're also very grateful for the support of our co-sponsors, the Environmental Law Center at the University of Cologne, Germany, the Institute of Environment Education and Research at Bharati Vidyapith University in India, Tilburg University in the Netherlands, and the University of Barcelona Faculty of Law in Spain. And thank you to everyone at Stetson who has been working hard to make this virtual conference possible, especially Aaron Okino in our Biodiversity Institute, and Damon Johnson, who is behind the scenes with media services, making sure that everything runs smoothly. Thank you. A few housekeeping matters before we begin. We are recording this session. With respect to CLE, Stetson has applied for continuing legal education credits to the Florida Bar. Due to COVID-19, however, the Florida Bar is closed and is not issuing accreditations at this time. So we will follow up with our attendees after the event regarding CLE credits. We do not apply for CLE in other states, but we will work with you individually to assist in self-reporting. The presenters, if they have PowerPoints, will be sharing their screens to display the PowerPoints from their own desktops. And so there may be a short lag time as we move the controls over to each presenter. We do want to leave time for Q&A and for discussion. That's one of the great things about this conference over the years are the discussions that we have after the presentations. Also in the hallways, of course, and at coffee breaks, we won't be able to do that as much, but we do have built into the program time for Q&A, and you can ask your questions in the question box and we can read it for you. Or if you'd like, just please ask, note that you have a question and ask to be unmuted, and we'll do so after the presentation. When asking a question, it would be helpful if you could state your name and affiliation. And to the extent that you are not speaking, if you could just please keep your mics on mute. A few words about Stetson University College of Law. We are Florida's first law school, founded in 1900. We are on a beautiful campus located in the Tampa Bay area of Florida in the United States, and we certainly hope that you have an opportunity to visit us at some point in the future. We are perhaps best known for our advocacy and legal research and writing programs, as well as our strong environmental law program. The Institute for Biodiversity Law and Policy at Stetson coordinates our environmental law activities, which includes events such as the International Wildlife Law Conference, the Foreman Biodiversity Lecture Series, as well as the Stetson International Environmental Moot Court Competition, which we are holding virtually online in conjunction with this conference. And indeed, some of our speakers will be participating as judges in that virtual moot court competition. The Institute is also actively involved in research. One of our big projects right now is funded by the McCann Foundation. We are taking a look at long-term protections of restored streams and wetland sites in the United States. Our public service component includes work with some multilateral environmental agreements, such as the Ramsar Convention and its Scientific and Technical Review Panel. And we also work with a regional treaty, the Inter-American Convention for the Protection and Conservation of Sea Turtles. We prepare amici briefs on behalf of scientists and scientific societies to help inform courts about the importance and the role of science, especially in Clean Water Act issues in the United States. And we have prepared briefs before a number of submitted briefs on behalf of these scientific societies in a number of courts, including the U.S. Supreme Court. If you're interested in collaborating with us, please reach out to us, to either myself, Paul Boudreau, or Aaron Okino. The history of the International Wildlife Law Conference, it was started by Will Burns, and we'll be hearing from Will a little bit later today. But Will started this with students in mind. And so it's always great to have students involved. We have some student presenters, but we also have, I know we have students registered from all over the world. And so we're really delighted that you could join us. Will also started up the Journal of International Wildlife Law and Policy. And the presenters are encouraged to submit their papers to Julep, as we like to call it, to the journal for publication. The International Wildlife Law Conference has been held in the United States, and it's also been held with our partners in India, the Netherlands, and Spain. I believe, however, this is the first time we are holding it virtually. The International Wildlife Law Conference for the 21st edition will be held at Cardiff University in Wales. The dates, of course, are to be determined, but we are working with Richard Cadell, who we'll be hearing from this morning as well, on the planning for our next in-person conference. And I look forward to seeing you all there and being able to share coffee or some other beverage. So we are holding this virtual conference in the shadow of COVID-19, which has connections to and ramifications for wildlife. The cause of COVID-19 has been attributed to human-wildlife interactions, in particular wildlife markets. And we have a special presentation by Professor Tianpo Qin on China's wildlife law in the context of public health. And the response to COVID-19, the shelter-at-home orders that we are all generally abiding by throughout the world, the retreat of people from public places has led to the reemergence of wildlife in some areas. Obviously, this is not a sustainable strategy for society in the long term, but it does demonstrate that nature and wildlife can recover if given a chance. And that, I think, is a particularly hopeful note, and one that I think that we will be discussing as we hear the presentations. This morning, we are going to start off with a presentation by Professor Paul Boudreau entitled Species in Law. And Paul is a professor at Stetson University College of Law, where he has published a variety of articles on wildlife law. He's the editor-in-chief of the Journal of International Wildlife Law and Policy, and before teaching, he litigated wildlife cases at the United States Department of Justice in Washington, D.C. And so with that, it's a real pleasure to turn the controls over to Paul, and if you could share your screen and unmute yourself, I will mute myself. Thanks.
I am unmuted and it says that I'm sharing my screen. Is that correct?
Yep, you're good to go.
Great. Thank you. As Roy so kindly said, I'm Paul Boudreau, a colleague of his at Stetson and editor-in-chief of the Journal of International Wildlife Law and Policy. We're always seeking good articles for publication, either some arising from this conference or to tell your colleagues to consider publication in the Journal of International Wildlife Law and Policy. And to write to me would be the easiest way to do that. As Roy mentioned, in this time of great concern over the health of Homo sapiens, I think it's fitting that we spend some time over the next 2 days discussing the fate of our fellow animals. And so today I'm just going to show pictures of animals. And I'll also start with a famous quote from the American Henry Beston just about 100 years ago, talking about animals. They are not our brethren, they are not underlings. They are other nations, caught with ourselves in the net of life and time, fellow prisoners of the splendor and travail of the earth. My topic today is the question, what is a species? What makes a group of animals distinct? And what separates this species from other groups of animals? For example, should the Southern African population of African elephant be considered a different species from the Central African population? And I approach this question from the viewpoint largely of law, in part because as a lawyer and researching this topic, I quickly got lost and drowned in biology, for which most lawyers are very poorly trained. But as I'll also attempt to argue, I believe there is value in a law-based perspective to the question of what constitutes a species. And what is clear to begin with is that species is largely a human concept. Darwin wrote early on, quote, I was much struck by how entirely vague and arbitrary is the distinction between species and varieties. End quote. It is clear there are no scanning codes under animals' tails and wings, and that legal terms that we use, such as the United States' Endangered Species Act's distinct population segment, really don't match biological definitions. But humans have always been interested and fascinated with animals and have attempted to classify them. Linnaeus, of course, was the first person to attempt modern taxonomy with his classification of animals in the 1700s. And we still use his general idea of kingdom, phylum, down to genus and species today. But his taxonomy was based mostly on morphology, appearance. And clearly these decisions involved human judgment. For example, a very famous animal that has tremendous controversy in Florida at Stetson University College of Law is based, the puma concolor. Is this a single species of animal despite its number of isolated populations throughout North America? Most people say yes, they're a single species. Although organizations such as the IUCN and the International Commission on Zoological Nomenclature often disagree. Now, Darwin's explanation of evolution through natural selection, that animals evolve over time through adaptation to their environment, such as a salamander who lives in a dark cave loses the ability to see, led to a new focus on determining species on common descent. Ernst Mayr, in the middle of the 20th century, developed the idea of a biological species concept, a focus on the species question on a group's ability to reproduce and to be isolated. And we have known humans for millennia that we can breed different species, but that the result is often infertile, such as the mule, which is bred from horses and donkeys. Later in the 20th century, there was an increased emphasis on genetics and the phylogenetic species concept has put a greater focus on evolutionary history in determining what constitutes a species. But there are other biological attempts at defining species. So for a lawyer, one is tempted to throw up one's hands and say, it's unclear, it simply looks like a judgment call to us. What are we to do? But law, unlike biology, needs answers to resolve disputes. My suggestion is that law should feel free to create its own definition of species to serve law's needs. So far, law has mostly shied away from the task of determining what is a species. CITES, for example, defines species as, quote, any species, subspecies, or geographical separate population. Doesn't really answer the question. Similarly, the United States ESA refers to a distinct population segment, but this is limited to vertebrates. Obviously, this was done to avoid local extirpation, but these decisions are clearly human policy judgments. Indeed, the term subspecies, which often people use to distinguish animals which we think are groups that are fairly close and we want to consider them species, but there's some differences in some way, it's a term that many biologists question. And it's often used simply more for geography than for any biology. And indeed, for the puma concolor, people have decided, well, we'll take the different populations and create different subspecies, even though we'll still agree there's only one species. The EU's Habitat Directive refers to the concept of a species of community interest, which is another nod to human values. The legal implications of these species determinations are significant. Should we take groups of similar animals and split them up into multiple species, or should we lump them together as a single species? This can have great significance for legal outcomes. One controversy is the California gnatcatcher in the United States. Are there two species or one? Biologists have concluded that it's probably best to lump them together in terms of the biological definitions as one species. But the agency in the United States charged with species protection, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, has said we're going to keep our traditional two species in order to keep them split so as to maximize the legal protections under the Endangered Species Act. That is clearly not a biological, but a policy decision. Similarly, the ibex individuals from the Middle East have been brought to the Alps to bolster the local population. But this creates concerns over outbreeding depression genetically. And so people have argued this justifies splitting up the populations. But splitting vigorously can have its drawbacks. For example, in Florida and the United States in the 1970s, this animal, the dusky seaside sparrow, went extinct, despite the possibility of interbreeding with very similar subspecies of sparrow. Introductions can be severely limited by splitting and eased by lumping. And this question also highlights the potential clash sometimes between wildlife preservation and animal welfare. The example of the California condor of the American West, one of the world's largest flying birds, all of the condors in the United States were removed from the wild to save them from extinction, even though some in the animal welfare movement decided that this was a humiliation of the animals and perhaps it was better dead than bred. To focus on the importance of the species delineation issue, I'll mention briefly 3 current controversies. And I will admittedly choose 3 charismatic species. And I do that for a reason, because those are the species that, frankly, humans often care most about, even if biologists sometimes scold them for doing that. I'll start off with the lion. Biologists say there is a single species, but there's a debate over subspecies. There is a small imperiled population in the Gir forest of India. Now, genetics say that this Asian population is essentially identical to some of the African populations. So to bolster the Gir population in India, should we allow introduction from Africa to Asia? A biologist might say, yes, this makes sense. Genetically, they are in effect the same. Culturally, however, the introduction might not be as welcome. How do we resolve this? And I suggest only law can resolve this question. Next is the orca, or killer whale, an animal that is widespread across the earth. I've read that some people say that in terms of its breadth across the planet, it is second only to Homo sapiens. Traditionally, biologists say there is only one species. Let's lump the different populations together, even though there are actual behavioral differences among the populations. And indeed, recently, the US Fish and Wildlife Service has decided that the resident southern population, which spends much time in the Puget Sound of northwestern United States, should be a distinct population segment for the purpose of protecting it under the law from local extirpation, even though this group is not even isolated from other groups. And this clearly reflects a human desire to protect behaviorally unique populations. And finally, of course, we return to the elephant. Traditionally, they're considered there were 2 species, African and Asian. And the elephant, of course, perhaps is the most famous of all the imperiled species. But recently, there's been a move towards separation of the southern African elephant, or the savanna elephant, from the Central African elephant. And if this split is recognized, the southern Africa elephant, there might face some new legal assessments, because southern African elephants are doing better. Their population numbers are rising. They have a much better conservation future. And perhaps for this reason, this split has been resisted by the IUCN. If we recognize that the southern elephant is separate, this may result eventually in less legal protection. Domestically, nations may allow more legal take. There may be a change in the status under CITES. It's conceivable. And there might be a greater allowance for community-based conservation, where local communities decide this is how we're going to handle our elephants in our community. And this might be welcomed by many people in Southern Africa who are bothered by the growing number of elephant-human conflicts. So in conclusion, how can law establish rights and resolve disputes, which is what law does, when biology does not give clear-cut answers? I suggest that law should acknowledge that science is nature's realm, while the species question is law's realm, is humans' realm. Law should not shy away from using species definitions that are different from biology's, or in fact that are different from those in other laws, because different laws serve different goals. For example, Some laws may view wildlife as a resource for use by humans. Thus, a law designed to conserve animals for genetic diversity might define species so as to foster the greatest genetic diversity for the future, however that might be. Another law might be designed to shore up a geographic ecosystem, such as, for example, the famous reintroduction of the wolves into Yellowstone National Park in the western United States, which had cascading effects for the local ecosystem, mostly for the good. The deaf and hear should serve this purpose in law. Perhaps lumping might be effective to allow for the greatest introduction and movement of animals to other ecosystems where they have been locally extirpated. Yet another purpose of law might be to serve in limiting human-animal conflict, and definitions might either lump or split to allow greater human control of animals when legally it is desired. And finally, a law might be crafted because of cultural, historic, or spiritual kinship to a particular group of animals, such as India's Gir lions, where perhaps the local people resist introduction of lions from another continent. Or even more prosaically, the Chincoteague, quote, ponies of the middle Atlantic United States, which are actually just small horses, but are famous for their local population in an area where there are no other wild horses. To foster these animals' population, law might favor vigorous splitting in terms of definitions to protect these populations with special human cultural kinship. Because unlike the lofty goals of science, which is to explain nature and the world, law has simple, practical, and varying goals. So in sum, by giving law its own domain in defining what it means to be a species, law can carry out the variety and needs of desires of that very complicated species, which is human beings. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Paul. That was an excellent opening presentation, and let's open it up now for questions and comments. So this is our first one. So we're trying to get used to the system here. So if you do have a question or would like to make a comment, please just type it into the question box. Paul, well, I had a particular question, and it's because I've seen the wild horses in Chincoteague. So what's the current status of those wild horses in law?
I think there are maybe some local state laws that give them some protection, but not necessarily because they are in any sense viewed as a distinct species or subspecies. But I certainly know that there are some threats to them, I think, as of disease, and there's very small numbers of them living in a very discrete area. But if we wanted to include in some larger, say, state species protection law of saying that all the protections of the, let's say, Virginia or Maryland laws about species protection to include a local, whatever you call it, subspecies, distinct population of the Chincoteague ponies, and thus marshal all the protections of a local imperiled species law, that might make perfect sense, even though biologists say there's nothing unusual about these animals other than they live in a certain area and they're famous because of a novel written in the early 20th century. And my argument is there's nothing wrong with law making these kinds of unbiological distinctions as long as law is clear about what it is doing.
So we have a comment and a question from Peter Jacques. So he notes that there's an annual sale after the horses are driven across the channel from their islands, and his question is, how have anti-environmentalists used species issues in law?
Certainly, there is constantly a debate, for example, and I'm familiar probably most with the United States Endangered Species Act, to avoid, say, splitting and to favor lumping so that simply the numbers of an animal, a species, appear to rise, such as the question is, should we include different subspecies of the West Indian manatee? If we say there are no subspecies, they're all the same species, the animal's numbers and its conservation future look rosier, and so they're less likely to be put on imperiled lists to begin with. And so the decision between splitting and lumping often creates very sharp divides between environmentalists and the, say, business community. Doesn't always mean that splitting is best, as I discussed, that splitting can make it difficult to do introductions or reintroductions as well. Good question.
All right, thanks, Peter. Thanks, Paul, for the response. Let's see. Okay, another question here from Catherine Schultz. How would unbiological distinctions apply to invasive species? For example, the silver spring macaws. Many consider these culturally important, but scientists consider them hazardous to the native Florida ecosystem.
Yeah, that's another tough question that I think only law can answer. But with regard to, say, an invasive species that, say, colonizes a certain area, say plants or something like that, if we allow for splitting, we might be able to say that a certain population that is invasive is split into another group, and maybe we can, if we find them to be dangerously invasive, we could even extirpate them because law decides that they should not have invaded a certain area. While if we lump them and gave them certain protections, that would make it more difficult, obviously, to remove them because of legal protections.
All right. Do we have other questions or comments? These have been some good questions, and this has been an excellent way to start off the conference with the broad view and considering what actually constitutes a species. To step back and consider that particular point. So, Paul, I very much appreciate the presentation, and we look forward to your contributions throughout the conference.
Thank you, and I look forward to hearing Ari's talk next.
All right. Thanks. Great. So we're gonna now move on to the Edward and Bonnie Foreman Biodiversity Lecture. The lecture series is sponsored and supported by Bonnie Foreman, an incredible friend of Stetson University College of Law, and so it's a real pleasure for me to introduce Ari. Ari Trauborst is with Tilburg University, Tilburg Law School. Ari is an associate professor of environmental law, interested in understanding and improving the contribution of international and European law to the conservation, restoration, and sustainable use of wildlife. Much of his current research concerns large carnivores and herbivores. His recent publications address rhinoceros conservation, leopard trophy export quotas, and wolf management. He frequently conducts advisory work for international entities, including the Bonn Convention on Migratory Species, the Berne Convention on European Wildlife, and IUCN, as well as national governments and NGOs. I think one of the most impressive things about Ari is that he is a certified wildlife tracker, and so we're really delighted that he could join us, and we also appreciate that Ari is going to be judging, one of the judges in our championship round of the Stetson International Environmental Moot Court competition that will conclude this weekend. In the United States right now, as people are sheltering at home, sheltering in place, one of the most popular shows on Netflix is called Tiger King, which is about people who have large cats. And if there's one takeaway from this crazy, crazy show, it's that cat people are passionate. And I think Ari has found that out in his in one of his most recent papers on domestic cats and international wildlife law, turning a blind eye to one of the world's worst invasive alien species. And so it'd be interesting to hear about not only about Ari's thoughts on this particular issue, but also the reaction that you've received, not only within academia but outside of academia. So Ari, thanks so much for joining us, and we look forward to your presentation. And
Good. So thank you very much, Roy, for that very kind introduction. It is a tremendous pleasure. I'm just fiddling with this. Yeah, trying to get my stuff in order. Okay. Do you just see my PowerPoint now? Is that okay?
yes, we see your
Okay,
PowerPoint,
wonderful.
and then we also see you just above it, so it's perfect.
Sure. Thanks a lot again. So it's really an honor for me to take part in the four-man lecture series. And I'm really sorry I can't be in Florida today. I was greatly looking forward to spending some time with you people. And I had also already gotten myself a copy of Sibley's Birds. It'll have to be another time. At any rate, a big thank you to Roy and Erin and all others over there for coming up with this online Plan B. So let me begin with a disclaimer that I recommend to anyone talking about cats. For the record, I have never kicked, shot, poisoned, strangled, drowned, suffocated, or otherwise harassed or killed a cat, nor do I harbor the ambition to engage in any of these activities in the future. I'm just covering my back with this with a view to Rule 0 discussed in another Netflix show. Cats are cute. They are funny. They are wonderful companion animals, and they help keep mice from the house. But what happens when we let them go outside? Yes, that too. They can cause a nuisance and a health hazard to people, but this talk is about wildlife. Cats hunt and kill wildlife, like this unfortunate gecko, and like this juvenile blackbird. And they go after anything that moves: rodents, rabbits, shrews, bats, birds, lizards, frogs, butterflies, dragonflies, and so on. and the numbers are big. We're talking millions and billions. Someday, my wife started asking me some hard questions, as she tends to do. Some of those questions she asked very appropriately in the place shown in the slide, the Forum of Athens, where long ago Socrates asked some hard questions of his own. So she says, Ari, you're the wildlife lawyer here. You always talk about those international laws on biodiversity protection and invasive alien species. What do they say about cats? How is it, for instance, that in the Netherlands, where we live, one alien species, the Egyptian goose, is subject to control and eradication measures, and another, much more harmful alien species, the feral cat, may not be killed? In wildlife law, are some animals really more equal than others? And how is it that I will get into legal trouble if I shoot a bird without a license, or allow my kid to shoot them, or allow my dog to chase after wild animals, but that I can at the same time, with impunity, allow my cat to go around killing wildlife day in and day out? How is it indeed, ladies and gentlemen? Imagine our amazement when we found out that over a century ago, the American author of a book about cats was already asking this question. He wrote, "We now legislate to protect birds, but place no limit on the increase in activities of their most destructive enemy. A man is liable to a fine if he kills a bird, but he may, with impunity, keep any number of cats to kill birds." Another statement from the same Edward Forbush that you could fast forward to 2020 without noticing it is this: "The widespread dissemination of cats in the woods and in the open and farming country, and the destruction of birds by them, is a much more important matter than most people suspect, and is not to be lightly put aside." Anyway, we started reading more about the issues involved and the scientific research on the impacts of cats and on the legislation. And I'm saying we because I have a few co-authors to introduce here. This is Han Somsen, professor of EU law at Tilburg University. And yeah, safety first. And this is Phillipa McCormack, lecturer in law at the University of Tasmania. And this is my wife, the lovely lady Elvira Martinez Camacho, who started this whole project and made sure we finished it and kept us sharp with probing questions all along the way. A century ago, Forbush already documented a lot of interesting facts about the impacts of cats on wildlife. But especially in the last 15 years, scientific knowledge about these impacts has grown exponentially. The next few slides just show you the literature we came across in our research. And all of these sources are in our published papers in case you're interested. In our research, we focused on all free-ranging domestic cats, from pets through farm cats and strays to fully feral cats. That's to say, cats which live fully independently from people. Free-ranging cats can impact wildlife in 5 basic ways, which often operate in combination. The first is predation, that is, simply ending other creatures' lives. The second is disturbance, or fear effects. For instance, one study used taxidermied cats to better understand such fear effects in blackbirds. It turned out that even briefly confronting blackbirds with such a cat model near their nest reduced subsequent feeding of the young by 1/3, and also led to a significantly increased risk of subsequent nest predation by corvids. The third effect is competition. When cats exploit the same food, space, or shelter as wild species. Simply put, every mouse eaten by a cat can no longer be eaten by an owl or by a marten. Fourth, a wide range of wild animals can be affected by diseases transmitted by domestic cats, such as toxoplasmosis, rabies, or feline leukemia. And fifth, domestic cats can hybridize with some wild cat species. Just to illustrate the predation impact of cats, here are some estimates of numbers of animals killed by cats each year in various countries. The key thing to note is that we are talking about many millions of prey items all over the world. In the US, the annual toll amongst mammals and birds even runs into the billions. To put those numbers into perspective, here are the US estimates for a range of human-related direct causes of mortality. So if you are worried about wind turbines because they kill hundreds of thousands of birds a year, or if you're worried about the impact of power lines which kill tens of millions of birds, then you should definitely be worried about the impact of cats. Here's the same information in a graph. As you can easily see, cats kill more birds than all the other causes combined. And here's a graph showing the results of a Canadian study, which are essentially similar. As a further illustration, here's a large-scale global study by Roland Kayes and others that came out just 2 weeks ago. It shows that pet cats kill between 4 and 10 times more wildlife per hectare than comparable native predator species. So forget about that line that you often hear that pet cats are just playing the same role in the ecosystem that would otherwise be played by natural native predators. So what can be done to avoid all of these adverse impacts? Sterilizing cats is an option and is the key feature of so-called trap, neuter, release policies implemented in many places to address the impact of stray cat colonies. An obvious downside here is that even if sterilizing a cat stops it from reproducing, it doesn't stop it from killing, disturbing, and competing with wildlife. Another option is fitting cats with bells, bibs, or other devices. However, none of these are fully effective in preventing predation and can in fact make other impacts worse. Take the beautiful color in the picture. It helps birds to spot the cat sooner, but that doesn't help nestlings and fledgling birds very much, and it only makes fear effects bigger. The third example shown here is cat-proof fencing, used especially in Australia as a last resort to protect vulnerable native wildlife in at least some areas from feral cats. This is, of course, expensive and unpractical at very large scales, and it still doesn't offer complete guarantees. For example, in 2012, a storm damaged part of the fence around a wildlife sanctuary in northern Australia. A few cats got in and killed about 250 bilbies, a significant part of the species' world population. And bilbies are the cute little marsupials on the slide. So the only thing that really works is keeping cats indoors, or at least in a cat-proof enclosure, like a catio. That is to say, to keep cats under the control of their owners at all times, like every other pet. By the way, this has the added advantages that your cat will not contract nasty diseases, or be eaten by a coyote, or be flattened by a truck, or meet another untimely end in the great outdoors. So it's about time for the question, what's law got to do with it? International wildlife law in particular. In our research, we applied the good old formula of combining relevant facts with relevant legislation, added the rules of interpretation to the mix, and outrolled our conclusions regarding the obligations of states in this area. We found dozens of international legal instruments that have something to say about domestic cats, even if they don't expressly mention them. Within those instruments, we detected 3 main categories of obligations: rules concerning invasive alien species, rules on site protection, and rules on native species protection. Many international agreements contain obligations to prevent and control the introduction of alien species that are invasive, that is to say, harmful to native biodiversity. These include the Global Biodiversity Convention and Migratory Species Convention, 2 instruments on migratory birds, and a series of regional agreements for Central America, Africa, and Europe. A recent story that made the news in the Netherlands can be used to illustrate what these obligations are about. An inhabitant of the town of Veenendaal, which is right next door from where I live, released 80 goldfish in a canal because he considered this an aesthetic upgrade of the surrounding shopping area. When the authorities found out, they obliged the man to fish them out of the canal again, to the last one, because goldfish are not native to the Netherlands. Let's look at an example of a legal provision here. According to the Biodiversity Convention, each contracting party shall, as far as possible and as appropriate, prevent the introduction of, control, or eradicate those alien species which threaten ecosystems, habitats, or species. In the fish example, retrieving every single goldfish from that canal was apparently considered appropriate in this connection. Even if, to my knowledge, goldfish have not caused the global extinction of many species, if any. How about cats then? Well, domestic cats are one of the world's very worst invasive alien species. As far as we know, cats were responsible, primarily or partly, for the global extinction of at least 63 species, comprising 40 bird species, 21 mammals, and 2 reptile species. Currently, domestic cats threaten at least a further 367 species with extinction. 2 recent comparative global assessments both put the domestic cat in the top 3 of most harmful alien species worldwide. In terms of Article 8 of the Biodiversity Convention, how is that for appropriate? A second set of obligations concerns the conservation of particular sites. Such obligations can be triggered when domestic cats pose a threat to any wildlife which the site in question is meant to protect. The example given here is from a European Treaty on Bat Conservation. It requires parties to identify sites of importance for bat conservation, such as roosts and breeding colonies, and to protect such sites from damage or disturbance, obviously including damage or disturbance caused by cats. A third relevant category of law consists of obligations requiring the strict protection of certain species, often listed in an annex, typically including a prohibition to capture, kill, or disturb animals belonging to those species, subject to limited exception possibilities. All of the instruments listed on the slide apply such obligations to protected species that are vulnerable to cats. And of all of these, Article 5 of the EU Birds Directive probably has the most radical implications. With regard to all native bird species, this provision requires member states to prohibit their deliberate killing or capture by any method, the deliberate destruction of eggs, the taking of eggs, and significant deliberate disturbance. The EU Habitats Directive, mentioned by Paul before, sets out a similar provision covering mammals, reptiles, and amphibians. The relevance of these provisions to cats obviously turns on the interpretation of the term deliberate. In a series of rulings, the EU Court of Justice has consistently held that for something to be deliberate in this context, no actual intent is required. It is sufficient that the actor accepted the possibility of killing, capturing, disturbing, or destroying the nest of a protected animal. For instance, according to the court, motocross racing in the habitat of the protected Cypriot grass snake equals deliberate disturbance, and setting up snares for unprotected foxes when there is a possibility that a protected otter could be caught equals deliberate capture or killing. As a guidance document by the European Commission puts it, the scope of the term deliberate includes unwanted but accepted side effects. And isn't that exactly what happens when I unlock the cat flap? In performing that very act, by allowing my cat outdoor access, I accept the possibility of the capture, killing, and disturbance of birds and other protected animals and the destruction of their eggs. And because Article 5 of the Birds Directive applies to all birds that are native to the EU, not just to rare or migratory species, and because birds can be found throughout the territories of the member states, it is very hard to escape the conclusion that member states are required, under EU law, to ensure that letting cats roam free outdoors is forbidden and effectively prevented. And that is our first conclusion, reproduced here. And our second conclusion on EU law concerns unowned cats. These must be removed or controlled when they pose a threat to protected species or sites. Regarding international wildlife law at large, we concluded that many national authorities around the world are currently required under international law to adopt and implement policies aimed at preventing, reducing, or eliminating the biodiversity impacts of free-ranging domestic cats, in particular by A, removing feral and other unowned cats from the landscape to the greatest extent possible, and B, restricting the outdoor access of owned cats. Now, nowhere did our legal analyses involve any rocket science, and I have to say we were not really surprised by these conclusions. What we were a bit surprised about is the apparent massive disregard and non-compliance when it comes to the obligations we identified. Wherever you look, cats continue to roam the landscape. And I don't know of a single country where cat owners are generally required under national law to keep their cats indoors, let alone a country where such a policy is effectively enforced. To understand this, we look to see what factors might explain and perhaps even justify this apparent non-compliance. Candidates include practical feasibility, scientific uncertainty, the interests of cats themselves, and the interests of their owners. With the partial exception of feasibility, we found that these factors at best provide explanations of non-compliance, not legally valid justifications. For instance, regarding the third factor, it's not clear that roaming outside is in the cat's own best interest. But for the sake of the argument, let's suppose that it is. Then we must ask this question. When applying wildlife law, is the pleasure which a cat takes in roaming free to be accorded greater value than the lives of all the wild animals that it kills? We did not find this to be the case in any of the legal regimes we analyzed. Or even at an individual level, to focus on the picture at the top right, does the fun and excitement this cat derives from hunting outweigh the fear and pain of the baby blackbird or the distress of its parents? We have not found any persuasive argument to support such an assumption, let alone an argument convincing enough to justify massive non-compliance with international wildlife law. Regarding the fourth factor, for someone who now owns a cat that goes outside all the time, changing that habit is problematic. That's obvious. But that's no different than a smoker who for decades was able to smoke anywhere she liked and now is no longer allowed to do so in many places. It's always about a balance between some individuals' freedoms, those of others, and the greater good. Smoking in public buildings and the workplace was banned because of increased knowledge about public health effects. Likewise, here we have the wish of individual cat owners to let their pets roam free on the one hand, and on the other, the by now very well documented great negative impact of free-ranging cats on the public good of biodiversity. And we're not even speaking about the serious public health issues around free-ranging cats. It's not obvious at all that the former should prevail, and not just prevail, but again, prevail to such an obvious and significant extent that it justifies large-scale non-compliance with international wildlife law. That basically left us with the hypothesis that the refusal of decision makers to address the free-ranging cat problem, or even to call it a problem, is motivated by fear of becoming unpopular with parts of their constituencies. And that hypothesis received a lot of support right after we published our research. So this is more or less a short summary so far of what we wrote in these two papers. The first was published in November 2019, the second in February 2020. Both appeared in respectable peer-reviewed journals published by Oxford University Press and by Wiley with the British Ecological Society. And then something hit the fan, and it hit it hard. By far, the most interesting experience in the whole process has been what happened after we published this. This aftermath confirmed and taught us a lot about human nature and about the limited extent to which academics like us are able to meaningfully engage with the press, with the lay public, with politicians, and with societal stakeholders like NGOs. Ecologists and fellow lawyers have generally reacted positively to our research. For instance, one newspaper quoted a law professor from Groningen as endorsing our interpretation of EU law, saying that the authorities should enforce the law against cat owners just as they have to against poachers or people driving a car through a breeding colony of birds. And another colleague at the University of St. Louis in Brussels decided to organize a moot court competition inspired by our research. As for the press, we offered one newspaper an exclusive first interview, which they published the day our first paper came out. And the University of Tilburg also put out a press release. And then our phones started ringing and never stopped. One camera crew after the other. The item made the national news in various countries. An absolute highlight for me was that we made the cartoon in my favorite national newspaper. I'm just pointing at a little bird here that says, "Officer, the dirty bastard has my wife." And then, of course, people had their say in the social media. The day after publication, I was teaching a class, and students implored me not to look at Facebook and Twitter, to spare me the unfriendly things people were saying about us and about our research. Anyway, if you were to consider attention as such a measure of success, then we did pretty well. Our paper got the highest altmetric score, which measures media and social media attention, of all law literature published last year, eclipsing publications about gun laws and about physical attractiveness and criminal justice. I hinted at the subtle sting in some of the reactions we received from readers, and I would feel bad not sharing some of the raw data with you. So here are quotes from some emails I got, translated from Dutch and German. "What an idiot you are, man. You really have nothing sensible to say? You did all those expensive studies and then start whining that all cats must stay inside? Did you fall from the crib onto your head as a child? Do something useful with your life, you retard." And another one, "Stop your driveling about cats. This could end badly." And, "Is this what we call a professor nowadays? Someone who prefers to defend vermin? I call such people cat haters and doemstudierte unerfarene Friesersche." Trust me, that last bit just sounds better in German. These were some of the more eloquent reactions we received. Follow me now to a deeper level. I'll just give you a few seconds to read and digest these only slightly censored messages for yourselves. Also here you will find some German bonus content. Now, I've published, as Roy mentioned, about wolf management, rhino horn trade, trophy hunting, and I thought those were controversial topics. But I've never seen anything like this until I wrote about cats. Next level is politics. Members of the Dutch parliament hurried to reassure worried cat owners. Take MP von Martels. Mere hours after publication of our research, his own superior knowledge of European nature conservation law and about the ecological impacts of cats provided him with the confidence to declare that our conclusions were absolute nonsense, while adding that we should not make this issue bigger than it is. I agree on that one, it's big enough as it is. With similar confidence, MP Weverling assured his constituency that this is, of course, complete nonsense. Europe has nothing to say about our pets. Both MPs, by the way, are from mainstream parties that are in the current government coalition. The executive branches of the Dutch and EU governments also reacted on the very same day. The Dutch Minister of the Environment basically pussyfooted around the issue without addressing the merits. And then the spokesperson of the European Commission. Free movement of cats. That makes no legal sense, of course. So why does he say it, other than from a knee-jerk reaction to prevent any further anti-EU sentiments from arising? You'll have noticed that the main responses we have seen so far are aggression, ridicule, and dismissal out of hand. Where are the substantive arguments, the real dialogue? Not here. Another Dutch MP, Geert Wilders, had this to say: "As far as I am concerned, all cats can go outside whenever they please, and let us securely lock up the lunatic pseudo-scientists who make up this kind of nonsense." On the bright side, these two MPs took the issue seriously and filed written questions. To this day, however, the minister has only provided a set of evasive answers, dodging the key questions. Now, with some positive exceptions, the response of most NGOs, even big ones whose core business is bird conservation, was to distance themselves from our conclusions rather than embracing them, again, apparently for fear of antagonizing cat-owning members. To wrap this up, it is again appropriate to quote Edward Forbush. Questions regarding the outdoor activities of cats, he writes, in 1916, are causing much dissension. The discussion has reached an acute stage. Medical men, game protectors, and bird lovers call on legislators to enact restrictive laws. Then ardent cat lovers rouse themselves for combat. In the excitement of partisanship, many loose and ill-considered statements are made. Like old King Solomon would say, there is no new thing under the sun. Finally, there is this. It is difficult and costly to tackle most drivers of biodiversity loss, such as habitat degradation, unsustainable agriculture, and climate change. By comparison, addressing the free-ranging cat problem is easy, with significant benefits to biodiversity. This is low-hanging fruit, and it's a shame not to pick it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ari. That was a great talk. That was thoughtful and thought-provoking. It also, I have to say, so you had the Ramsar Convention listed on there, and I've worked with the Ramsar Scientific and Technical Review Panel for more than a decade, and we have dealt with issues involving invasive alien species, but I don't ever recall a discussion about domestic cats, and I think that also links up well with Paul's talk in terms of definitions and definitions of species, but also what constitutes an invasive alien species, and clearly on the impact that you've demonstrated, domestic cats should be considered invasive alien species. Let's see. We have a question from got a few questions I think coming up. But let's see. First one from Jess Owley from University of Miami said, should countries pass laws that prohibit cat ownership or just prohibit cats from ever being outside? What should the penalties be? Should we also consider dogs?
Yeah, good question. So all we did, of course, was map what international obligations there are, and see to what extent they're being implemented, and perhaps not, and for what reasons. Now, so the question, I just lost it.
Let's see. There was a question on.
Yeah, sorry, I've got it. So,
okay.
Sorry, ownership or outdoor access. So what matters from the point of view of all of these international wildlife law obligations is the outdoor access of cats. So having cats as such as pets inside your house under your control is the same as for dogs, as for snakes, as for ferrets. All of these animals generally have to be under the control of the owner, except cats. And we haven't found a good reason to treat cats differently from all of the other pets. So that would be my answer to that question.
Okay. Let's see. We have a let's see. Question for Ari from Richard Cadell. Firstly, thanks for a tremendous presentation. Also, Richard, you just want to unmute your mic and make your comments and ask the question?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Roy.
Yeah.
Hey, Ari, how are you doing? Great to see you. Thanks for again a wonderful presentation. I love the wolf on your cupboard as well, by the way. Really interesting work. And just on a hunch, I was looking at the Council of Europe Convention on the Protection of Pet Animals while you were talking there, and it was quite interesting to see some of the clauses in there where they refer only to keeping animals in the household, providing accommodation, providing adequate opportunities for exercise, which presumably can be done indoors, preventing escape. And I was wondering if you'd come across anything that approximates a right to roam in wildlife law, obviously aside from the CMS, or in the animal rights instruments for any animals who are capable of domestication, and therefore whether there was any scope for all the cat activists to kind of build a case that there is a right to be outside for these animals.
Yeah, very important topics. Thanks, Richard. So the adequate opportunities for exercise that you mentioned, as required by this convention on pets in Europe, they should, according to other provisions in the convention, be offered indoors or on a leash or within cat-proof enclosures. Interestingly, the convention requires owners to take all reasonable measures to prevent escape. But more importantly, there's a conflict clause. So the express statement that, quote, nothing in this convention shall affect the implementation of other instruments for the protection of animals or for the conservation of threatened wild species, unquote. So that entails that the obligations flowing from the birds and habitats directives would remain unaffected by the pet convention. I hope that that's a beginning to an answer to your question.
Yes, indeed. Sorry, thanks very much.
Thanks, Richard. From Paul Boudreau, thank you for a thought-provoking talk. Is there evidence that a home-fed cat is less of a threat outside than a feral cat is?
As far as I can recapitulate the literature that we studied, I'm not sure there is such a clear pointer that shows that. So cats are very individual characters, like people. They've got their own personalities. Some are lazy, some are very active hunters. Of course, there is the important distinction that not all pet cats hunt. There are some pet cats that just don't hunt. Feral cats, 100% of them hunt or they die because they have to catch all of their food. So that's an important distinction. But in terms of the quantity that of prey average killed by pet cats and feral cats, I'm not exactly sure because it cuts both ways. These fed pet cats, they don't need the prey for sustenance. But on the other hand, by feeding them and keeping them in good condition, they've got time on their hands. They don't have to spend time doing complicated things. They can do whatever they like. And if it's chasing after things that move, then they'll do that. So they might even catch more than feral cats do.
We have a question in terms of the reaction to your papers. Have you faced pressure from university administration?
I have not. I have to say, the person in charge of the press release was not very pleased with our findings, being a cat person. But she dealt with this very professionally, and then in the aftermath, we got some support in the form of increased vigilance by the security department of our offices for a while after we received the various threatening messages.
From Mark Campens, in your research, has the civil law perspective also been included, particularly from the perspective of the extra contractual liability that the cat owner may have?
Interesting too. Thanks for bringing that up. We have not dealt with that in our research, but there's so much we did not touch on in our research, and that is very interesting. So it's definitely an important component. So for the Netherlands, I know, and I suspect this is similar in many places, that if my cat would run across the street causing a car accident, and they can trace the cat back to me, then I would be responsible. I would be liable for that accident because my pet was not under my control. So in the same way, I would be, so formally also under Dutch nature conservation legislation, I would be the responsible person for every bird that my cat kills. And I do know of an interesting case where there was a civil law conflict in court in the Netherlands some years ago, whereby one person complained about the neighbor's cats defecating in the neighbor's in the wrong yard, and the judge in fact ordered the cat owner to keep better control of the animals, and that for every time there would be another incident, they would have to pay, I think, €1.
What's the enforcement mechanism for the EU birds and habitat directives? If member states are not abiding by their obligations, what's the mechanism to require some compliance?
Right. So the enforcement in EU law runs on two levels. So if there is non-compliance with, for instance, Article 5 of the Birds Directive, one thing that could happen is that an NGO, in this case, would go to a national court and there invoke the EU law, so Article 5 of the Birds Directive in this instance. And I wouldn't be surprised if in the near future one such case would arise where people just say, look here, Article 5 of the Birds Directive, we know the interpretation by the Court of Justice of the term deliberate, 1 + 1 is 2. The government should keep these cats off the street. So that would be really interesting. That would be an interesting test case. And the other level is enforcement by the European Commission against member states that don't comply with the law. But if the statement by the spokesperson of the EU Commission that I included in my presentation is any indication, there's not a lot of willingness of by the Commission to antagonize member states over an issue like cats.
Yeah, Volker, did you want to? Did you have a question? Oh, I see your video popped up. Okay, let's see. We have some other questions. You may have covered this a bit. Sorry, hold on just a second. So let's see. It's noted that when dogs harm humans and other animals, they're put down in countries like the United States, and that owners face punitive costs and charges. Then why are cats and their owners excluded from facing the consequences even after causing significant damage to biodiversity? I think you covered
Good
some
question.
of the political consequences there, right? let's see, Aaron, you've noted that there may be some questions coming up in the question box that I do not see. So if you see some additional ones, if you could please just jump in and ask them.
I think you might have covered this, Ari. Are there any advocacy organizations in the EU that are specifically calling for keeping cats indoors? And then you touched on this a bit. Are there other destructive animals that you think we should or could be regulating?
Yeah, so that issue touches on the NGO position. I know there's one small animal rights group in the Netherlands that's taking the issue seriously. I know in the US there's this wonderful Cats Indoors program by the American Bird Conservancy. I'm not aware of anything similar to that. So an organization in a science-based way calling for win-win situation with happy birds and happy cats. So BirdLife Netherlands was a quite disappointing experience. So like BirdLife UK and many other organizations, they have taken this hyper nuanced approach to the issue for many years. And they also stuck to that when our research was in the press, citing difficulties with enforcement, stressing that there's still scientific uncertainty about exact numbers, about exact impacts of cats on particular bird populations. And then around New Year's Eve, it struck me when I read so this is an interesting anecdote. When I read in BirdLife Netherlands journal about fireworks, they said fireworks is a nightmare for birds. We can be brief about this. They said every year around midnight when we explode all these firecrackers and rockets, birds in the whole country fly around disoriented. Some of them might even fly into buildings and die. And they concluded saying we should just stop this. And so that's one night. It's disturbance, some loss of energy, some dead birds, and not a lot of scientific evidence propping this up. And yet they feel confident to call for stopping this damaging habit to birds. And then you've got the cats, and then suddenly they go into hyper nuanced sensitive mode. And there was another part to the question, dogs. Some similar issues with dogs. I think dogs is running ahead of regulating cats. So in several parts of the world, loose dogs are still a major problem for wildlife. In some other parts, it's already regulated to quite some degree. In the Netherlands, for instance, it's quite strict. You cannot let your dog run loose anywhere except in designated areas. And if you do, and your dog goes after a hare or a roe deer or something like that, they will try to track you down as an owner, and you will definitely get a fine. I don't know of any cat owner that ever received a fine for what their cat did.
So Ari, I think you had mentioned this in your talk, but is there anywhere even at the local level where there are prohibitions on allowing free roaming pet cats?
Yeah, I believe there are some local in New Zealand and perhaps Australia, local areas where policies are quite a bit stricter, because there the impact of cats is really high on those native species that they have. And we also found, because one of our co-authors was Australian, and she found that the reception of the research was not nearly as hostile in Australia as it was in Europe.
Mm-hmm. What was the outcome of the moot court competition?
It's taking place on 27 April. So.
Okay, good. So are they moving along in virtual rounds as well?
I guess they will. It was a closed affair for only their university students, so I'm not quite sure at what stage they are, but it was interesting.
Yeah, so I'd actually be interested in speaking with them because yeah, it could be something that we would want to do more broadly, perhaps.
Yeah,
and,
happy to put you in touch.
Okay, all right, thank you. Let's see, do we have other questions? Let's see, Aaron, if I'm missing a question, please jump in. While she's looking for that, let me ask, you had mentioned that there was questions within the Danish system. There's questions to Parliament, or questions from Parliament, and what does that process involve?
Yeah, so it's written questions in Parliament from MPs to the competent minister involved, in this case, Minister of Environment, and they asked a lot of questions on the basis of our research. And then, so the minister gave these very evasive answers. So I'm expecting there will be follow-up questions, because she dodged the question of whether she agreed that Article 5 of the Birds Directive and the interpretation of deliberate by the EU Court of Justice thus entails that cats must remain indoors. She just tiptoed around that issue. And that's, of course, the question that they wanted her to address. So I guess this is to be continued.
All right. Well, let's see. If there are no final questions or comments,
everyone for being here. We are so glad that all of you could join us for the virtual 20th International Wildlife Law Conference. My name is Erin Okino, and it is my pleasure to introduce our first panel of the day, which is going to focus on fisheries management and marine biodiversity conservation issues. Our first speaker is Dr. Richard Cadell. He is a senior lecturer at Cardiff University in Wales. He specializes in the law of the sea and international environmental law, and Richard is particularly interested in wildlife conservation, fisheries, marine mammals, and polar law. He is the editor and author of numerous publications. He serves on the editorial boards for 3 different international environmental publications, and he's also an academic member of Francis Taylor Building, the UK's leading environmental barristers. Richard is going to present Where's the Catch? Climate Change, Shifting Fish Stocks, and the Challenges of Transboundary Management. Thanks so much for being here, Richard.
Thank you very much indeed, Erin. And I'll just start this off a second. But just to convey my thanks to you, Roy, and the technical team at Stetson for your incredible work in keeping this show on the road. So my theme today is going to be looking at well, if Roy started off with a statement that Tiger King is about people who like large cats, then this, with the same understatement, is something of a mid-ranking problem that we're going to be confronted with. So what I'm going to be looking at today is the problem presented by shifting fish stocks and some of the challenges that that's going to pose for transboundary management, and some of the things that we're starting to do well with that, but also I think raising just as many answers as questions, I should say. So essentially I'm just gonna move this little thing so I can see my actual slides there. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about what the current and projected trends in fish and fish stocks actually are, and to kind of give us a sense of where these sort of problems are going to lie and the types of issues that we're going to have to confront in the future, and look at how regional fisheries management organizations have responded to this issue. And I think the answer to that is fairly minimally. This is certainly something that presents considerable challenges for them as legal structures, and also as epistemic communities. But it's not all going to be doom and gloom. I'll have a little look at some of the things that we're doing well, in particular some of the rather far-sighted elements that we have in dealing with new fishing areas and the influx of new species into other parts of the world, and some of the good practices that RFMOs are doing, at least with each other, if not generally. Then I'll have a little look at how we might reconsider, reinterpret some of the existing laws that we have at our disposal in order to confront the problem of changing fish stocks, and then sort of end up with a couple of potential rather more tentative areas in which this might move into before providing some broad conclusions on this. So first and foremost, a little bit on the trends in where we're at with fish stocks. As we know, the oceans are warming, and this is having a profound effect on the range of particular species, and in particular most of the commercially fish species, but also a lot of the fish species and other species that constitute their staple prey. So fish are moving around the place. Fish have always moved around the place. That's not necessarily an issue. The problem has been that fish have tended to stay in around the same sort of broad area. But what they're doing now is they're moving on unprecedented levels, and the projections and the models that we see, even on the most conservative basis, suggest that they will be moving on quite a profound basis that has significant implications for the international legal system as a whole. So you've got something of a perfect storm at the moment, where stocks are depleted. If you look at the FAO's projections on things, roughly 2/3 of stocks are either over capacity or at the very limits of capacity. We've got overfishing, we've got illegal fishing, and now we've got stocks moving around the place and confounding the current regulatory system that we have in place. This is good news for some people, though. For the more northerly jurisdictions, places like Norway, the Faroe Islands, Iceland, where the waters are cool but warming, this is good for them. And we've seen this playing out in terms of conflict with the European Union, where stocks of herring and mackerel have moved up into the Faroese waters, and that has created problems in firstly setting quotas and also in ensuring access to the stock as well. But for every winner there are multiple losers, and in particular these are countries that can ill afford to lose their fish and their resources. It's projected that the vast majority of fish will move out of the tropical regions. A lot of these countries are, of course, developing countries. They have limited alternative food sources, limited alternative industries, and so as a result of this, this is likely to have a very profound effect on a number of these particular jurisdictions. And the question arises as to what these jurisdictions might be able to do about this, or how we might start to think about piecing together a system that might be a little bit more fair. It's not just an issue of fish moving around the place. This has scope for very, very real conflict. So far, the conflicts have been largely legal, and we touched upon the Atlanto herring issue with the Faroe Islands and the European Union that was troubling the World Trade Organization's dispute resolution bodies for a little while until they arrived at a solution. But also there's scope for quite physical conflict in this, and the picture on the slide there is slightly out of context in the Brexit debate, whereas these are the British and French fishermen fighting it out over the Channel Islands. But it's not beyond the realms of possibility, and in fact a lot of conflict management modelers have considered that this is likely to create a situation whereby we might be confronting a possible breach of the peace issue. And also creates profound jurisdictional difficulties. If fish are moving in and out of different jurisdictions, this might lead to the recasting of fisheries relations and how we might have to look at that in the future. To give you an idea of the extent of this, a couple of years ago, we published a paper in Science where myself and a group of other, well, they were the biologists, I was not the other, with a group of biologists, managed to track the movement of fish, or at least postulate the movement of fish based on warming waters and the various projections that came from the IPCC. And we noticed there was obviously a very high proportion of fish species moving into the polar regions, possibly. There are some scientific barriers to that as well, so we're not entirely sure quite what that's going to look like. But certainly we could see that a number of transboundary species were moving in between different EEZs and indeed out of different EEZs as well, which have profound implications for future management. Just a quick primer on how things are managed as they are. We see that under the Law of the Sea Convention, under Article 56 in the EEZ, coastal states have sovereign rights over marine living resources, and they have particular obligations to prevent the overexploitation of stocks and keep them at MSY, and also to promote optimal utilization. Now, implicit in that are ecosystem management requirements, although they're not particularly large in that. Similarly, we see this largely mirrored on the high seas context, and we use regional fisheries management organizations, groups of states that come together to deal with stocks to regulate the particular fishery in question. So how have RFMOs actually done this? Well, there are real problems confronting RFMOs. Usually they are created for single species, so they don't necessarily always have holistic ecosystem mandates. Or they're only concerned with the effects of climate change on a particular species, such as tuna or salmon, for instance. Jurisdictional questions arise where you start to see fish moving from one RFMO into another, and whether or not they actually have the formal powers to deal with this. There are also a lot of practical restrictions facing RFMOs. They're not usually the best resource of international organizations. Their scientific capacity is mainly comprised of fisheries scientists who are looking at quota allocations rather than the more holistic ecosystem approaches that climate change issues actually require us to do. And having looked through a whole host of the various RFMOs currently in existence and seeing what they're doing on climate change, it's actually quite sobering to see that very few conservation and management measures adopted by RFMOs deal with climate change or associated effects such as acidification. It's usually the ones like CAMLAR. People debate whether or not that is a true RFMO, but it certainly has fisheries powers. Where the bodies like that do have an ecosystem mandate have wrestled with this a little bit more. But generally speaking, a lot of the RFMOs have yet to really dip their toe in the water as to future climate change implications for their organizations. And this also seems to be an institutional issue as well. A lot of RFMOs at the moment are conducting performance reviews on a 3 to 5 year basis. And again, it's very sobering to look through these performance reviews and actually see that climate change issues is stuck on the back or referred to in passing or rarely referred to at all. A similar thing happens in the review conference of the UN Fish Stocks Agreement, where climate change issues are also very much tucked towards the back and very much subordinate to issues on things like allocation and participation. And essentially, I think all we can do is sum up the response of RFMOs to date with being kicking the can down the road, talking about future research commitments, but not really wrestling with the issue directly at the moment. One possible alternative situation that we do have, or what does the international system do well? Well, we do have the setup to deal with new fisheries. So as fish are moving around the place, they're being fished for the first time in particular locations. And one particularly far-sighted piece of legislation or a provision within the UN Fish Stocks Agreement is its Article 6.6, which deals with new and exploratory fisheries. And in this particular context, it requires where states want to set up a new fishery, they have to bring in conservation and management measures on a cautious basis that provide for restrictions that remain in force until there is sufficient data to allow for a clear panoramic view of the long-term sustainability of stocks. And then after that, further conservation and management measures can be taken based on that assessment to work out whether or not the fishery can actually proceed on a gradual development on this. Now, so far, we've seen this emerging in the context of the Southern Ocean with CAMLR, which largely drove this particular procedure, and it was copy-pasted based on what was happening in CAMLR in the mid-1990s, and then put into the UN Fish Stocks Agreement. So we've seen that CAMLR has set up a number of new fisheries within its area of jurisdiction, and I think on the whole, it's actually worked quite well. It has allowed for a very limited degree of fishing, and in that case, we've been allowed to build a clearer system of the ecosystem, or a clearer view of the ecosystem, before taking decisions as to whether or not an enhanced degree of fishing is ultimately appropriate. And in the Ross Sea, for instance, CAMLR has actually provided the first example of a fishery that started out ab initio, has worked on the basis of incredibly stringent restrictions, and has built up a volume of scientific data that allows us to take a view that there might well be a case for allowing a new commercial fishery to develop. And following this CAMLR approach, a number of other RFMOs have actually done this too. We've also seen this on a very precautionary basis within the Arctic, where the Central Arctic Ocean Fisheries Agreement of 2018 has built in a 16-year moratorium on unregulated commercial fishing. So if fish do ultimately move into the Arctic on levels and numbers that are commercially sustainable and viable, then it will follow the CAMLR approach of having a very, very small and then graduated fishery that allows us to build in a lot of scientific and observer-based control. So there are elements of international law dealing quite well with this problem, or at least having far-sighted legislation that allows us to move through the gears where fish start to colonize new areas. One possibility we can also do is to have a look at how fisheries legislation might evolve. And here's some things that are happening in a Brexit context. We are at the moment working our way through our new fisheries law to deal with the situation of coming out of the common fisheries policy. It's now currently at the committee stage, although currently on a corona-induced furlough, although I believe that the intention is to keep working on this remotely. What is interesting is the UK has built in a series of core objectives, of 8 particular objectives, one of which is climate change. So there is a climate change objective in our prospective fisheries law. That's the good news. The bad news is that, as with a lot of fisheries law, they're characterized by vagueness and ambiguity. And what we're seeing is that the articulation of the climate change objective is limited to these 2 approaches. To ensure that the adverse effect of fish and aquaculture activities on climate change is minimized. Rather clunky formulation seems to suggest, well, should we make sure that fish and aquaculture doesn't hold back climate change? Is that what they mean by that? And fish and aquaculture activities must adapt to climate change. That's as far as it goes. There's no guidance in the extensive 100 to 200 page explanatory notes as to what this means. The linkages with our environmental bill, which are projected to deal with climate change, are also unclear. So building this international law is quite something of a challenge. One thing we're also seeing well is that RFMOs themselves are starting to work quite effectively together. Again, this has been largely driven by CAMLR, which has worked closely with the neighboring tuna committees to deal with tuna stocks and, by way of extension, tuna fishing fleets that are now coming into the CAMLR area. and they've established an MOU with an agreement whereby they will have a lot of data exchange and management decisions. One thing that CAMLA has done is classified any tuna fishing in the CAMLA area as being exploratory, which means that in order for it to be legitimately undertaken, it has to be done under these very strong exploratory fisheries conditions. Problem with that is there is a huge amount of illegal fishing in CAMLA that obviously doesn't take this into consideration. Elsewhere, some of the other RFMOs, NAFO and NAF in the North Atlantic, have adopted shared management approaches where a redfish quota has been allocated, where it was coming in from one RFMO's back garden and into another. And there are examples of working this on a bilateral basis, notably between the US and Canada. I'm sure Cam's going to explore some of these types of approaches a little later on this morning, afternoon, wherever you are in the world. Things that we can possibly do in order to reinterpret our international law on this. If you have a real interest in stocks, then you have a right to participate in an RFMO. Now that sounds great, as articulated in Article 8 of the UN Fish Stocks Agreement, but in reality, a lot of RFMOs, in fact most RFMOs, have been incredibly exclusionary towards new entrants, and in fact most of them have really pulled down the shutters on anybody that wants to join. What a lot of RFMOs are doing is, in order to be able to claim fishing rights, you have to demonstrate a footprint within the area of the RFMO itself in which you have undertaken fishing, which has led to a lot of states staking a claim and putting out quite exaggerated fishing footprints. So one way we could look at this is by potentially looking at fishing histories, and if staple stocks have moved out of your EEZ, for instance, and into an RFMO's area, then it might be one way of saying, one way of considering how we might move forward within the current framework that we have. That said, fisheries law is inherently conservative, and there's very little tradition of bringing in flexible mechanisms, individual transferable quota, other types of mechanisms that you do see replicated on a more community and local basis on an international basis. So it certainly seems to be that RFMOs and indeed their constituent member states are actually quite conservative when it comes to thinking outside the box of using existing powers and laws. One other possibility we might look at is how we compensate for lost fish stocks. There are examples of fisheries management organizations compensating where states have taken too much fish, and a good example of this is a bilateral agreement between Australia and New Zealand over orange roughy, and in fact it was found that Australia had taken too much fish and New Zealand was able to take an enhanced quota outside of the Australian quota in order to make up the balancing act of this. And a lot of bilateral management is focused on collaborative action, albeit after they've provoked a fight over this. But again, fisheries bodies do not really have a long history of thinking outside the box on dealing with restorative justice. One possible mechanism that we do have emerging is that within the field of global climate change, and that's the Warsaw International Mechanism for Loss and Damage Associated with Climate Change, developed under the UNFCCC. This remains a somewhat mysterious body, and one that is still very much in its nascent process, and it hasn't really exhibited a great deal of consideration of oceans in the first place, and where it has, fisheries have not really been part of it. And the political complexities associated with fisheries do kind of inhibit this being front and center in compensatory bases, and at the moment they focus more on climate migration and losses of territories and that sort of thing. But nonetheless, this could be a forum within which these sorts of arguments are displaced if RFMOs are unable to get their own houses in order on a regional basis. So some very brief and tentative conclusions on what is, I suspect, a paper more at its early stages than fully formed. Is at the moment we're seeing that fisheries dynamics are changing incredibly rapidly, and this brings a lot of scope for conflict, and it's exposing governance gaps and inherent inequalities in the system. And it's also exposing that international fisheries as an infrastructure is largely unprepared for this. Climate change has not really been baked into the ecosystem considerations of a lot of different RFMOs. So while some have provided some far-sighted provisions, certainly dealing with new influx of fish and establishing new fisheries, we are largely characterized by conservatism. But one thing we are starting to see is an increasing recognition that cooperation is likely and necessary, albeit that there's not a great rush to be doing this. So the main take home is that climate change really is a looming crisis for RFMOs, and they really need to start looking at this in a more holistic manner. And in the process, it does potentially give us an opportunity to rethink some of the more problematic elements of fisheries regulation, such as participatory rights and inherent inequalities in this. With that, I think I've had my allotted time and perhaps a little bit more. So I will say thank you very much and stay safe.
Thank you so much, Richard. It was an excellent way to start the panel. You identified the sort of the vast scope of these issues and how climate change is going to continue to impact those issues that were already challenging to begin with. And I think what we're going to do is save all of the questions until all of the panelists have spoken. So if you do have a question for Richard, please go ahead and type that into the question or chat section and just identify that it's a question for Richard, and then at the end we will give him an opportunity to answer your questions. But thanks again, Richard, we really appreciate it, and we'll give you the chance to answer some questions just in a bit. So Dr. Jacques is our next speaker. He is a professor of political science and part of the team at the National Center for Integrated Coastal Research at the University of Central Florida. He's an Earth Systems Governance Senior Fellow, former co-director of the Florida Climate Institute at UCF, and the president of the Association of Environmental Studies and Sciences for 2018 to 2020. He is going to present the World Ocean Regime, Polluted Waters, and Exhausted Fisheries. Peter, thank you so much for being here with us today.
Yeah, so this is work that is based on about 4 papers, one of which is for the International Studies Association's Compendium on International Politics generally. And the goal of that essay was to kind of lay out the landscape, the institutional landscape for fisheries and for pollution. And I'm not about to try and explain those things to a group of lawyers, but that and well, this is where I'm going to start off by kind of showing how across time we've had much more intensive interactions with the ocean in ways that are pretty unsustainable. So if you break up the way in which we've had relationships with the ocean, you know, we have the kind of pre-colonial period, which was mainly artisanal and had, you know, mainly with maybe some referred to as old coastal cultures that were not very intensive. There are some really good examples of the way that, say, oysters were managed by the Lenape in the New England area, where they were probably intensively harvesting oysters for 8,000 years at least. That sounds pretty sustainable, but as things go on, so of course, Mare Liberum and a colonial system. This is our first global kind of institution that you guys are all familiar with, where we also then start to take out the whales, right, with mercantile capitalist kind of political economy. Law of the sea, again, I don't have to tell you guys about that, but then we're starting a political economic system that's referred to as embedded liberalism, where after the Second World War, there was an agreement mainly between North America and Europe that we're going to pursue free enterprise, free markets, but at the same time, we're we're going to put in a social contract to ameliorate the kind of crises that capitalism creates. And that ends pretty much in the 80s, and this is where we're at now, under a kind of new liberal political economy. And probably the most controversial thing I'll say is that we believe that there is a world ocean regime that is not codified and is in a lot of ways contradictory to law of the sea. So and we're also in this place where a guy named John Ruggie says where it's a new governance situation where states are very reluctant to do anything ambitious about restraining their economic activities, at the same time that those economic activities on the ocean are really intensifying, creating big fishery problems, and of course the kinds of pollution that we're seeing. It's kind of new. I'll explain some of that in a minute. But each era comes with increased extraction, and of course we have done a pretty good job with controlling some pollution, like oil pollution dumped from ships. That's gotten a lot better over the 20th century. But at the same time, we think that, and this is probably hard for a legal group to accept, but we think that there is this kind of world ocean regime that's governing the world ocean in guiding towards just total production and increased volumes of, say, fish being taken out, with very little concern for social and environmental concerns. So if you break up pollution into the usual suspects, all the stuff that the dumping at sea conventions have dealt with pretty well, but our biggest pollution source is from on land, and I don't see states kind of moving very hard towards reducing that, which then puts us in a place where now we're dealing with what I call the invisibles. So carbon dioxide, nitrogen, heat, and then plastics are visible, obviously, but the microplastics, sometimes they're hard to see. But anyway, these are things that are just produced from the political economic system globally, right? So CO2 is acidifying the ocean, nitrogen is creating dead zones, and heat is changing the structure of the marine column, and thereby the currents. Plastics are this is just really grown into a giant problem. And of course, you've all read about the different ideas that people have to scoop up the plastics. But that I think part of that just comes from when the plastics are produced, they end up in the ocean. And of course, the new talks for protecting biodiversity beyond national jurisdictions isn't going to touch any of these. And one of my colleagues, Raquel Tiller, argued that the plastics absolutely should be in BBNJ, but it's not going to do that, I don't think. But the odd part about all this is that we're fundamentally changing, changing the nature of the oceans. And it used to be so, like this guy Ed Miles, he wrote a paper. This was in 2009. Said, in 1990s, I thought we were going to solve all these kind of ocean problems, but now we've got all these other ones too added on top, and this just means that that we're not governing the ocean in a sustainable way. If you look at global fish catch, this is the graph that everybody knows, but there's a kind of a hidden context to this. So you had exponential growth in the fishery catch, and now it's plateauing. Pauly and his colleagues actually argue that this is inaccurate, and that the plateau actually started in the 80s because of misinformation from mainly China. But if we look at that curve, it looks a lot like the equilibrium K phase of the adaptive cycle. So if you look at the bottom left-hand corner, the R phase is a growth phase in the system, and we really think that this is the way that fisheries work is complex adaptive systems. So we had enormous growth, obviously, from all the different kinds of ways we've developed fishing. But this plateau, if this is a representative, then the next phase is collapse. And I've argued elsewhere that this is plausible as a global phenomenon. That would be integrated, large marine ecosystem type collapses, and that's pretty scary. And I think it's because of the failure of government, the failure of governance. RFMOs have struggled. I really appreciated the talk we just had on RFMOs. Well, one day I was talking to a FAO official and I said, how come they're not dealing with climate change? He said, well, why would they? So there's obviously that's a big problem. Many of these fisheries are exhausted, as was noted. But something new is that this team here, Longo's team, have been arguing that instead of a collective action problem, what we really have is a tragedy of the commodity, which is driven by political economic goals of absolute growth. And I agree with that. And that's kind of what I think is going on. ABNJ, so area beyond national jurisdiction, is going. It was, obviously a really important idea that the biodiversity beyond national jurisdiction should be a priority. But then there's this clause in it that the BBNJ or ABNJ, how you want to say, should not undermine existing relevant legal instruments. And this sounds like just an overarching freedom of the seas kind of thing, contrary to conservation. That just kind of is a missed opportunity, I think. It's unfortunate. Why I think there is this uncodified, non-codified de facto regime for the ocean is because of this work that we did in marine policy and global environmental politics, which was a content analysis of all of the extant SOFIA reports, the State of the World's Fisheries and Aquaculture, and we analyzed that content statistically to show that, and this is real simplified right here, but that the categories of concern are ironically not food, and not surprisingly, overwhelmingly utilitarian kind of economic thinking, driving a goal of production and mindless production in some ways. Now, FAO says, hey, those the days of just concerning ourselves with growth is over, and we're really concerned about sustainability. I believe that's true, that they're concerned, but that is not the operating principles of fishery management these days. It's very much kind of about production to the detriment of all these other values, right? So justice or even science are not just, they're not making the map. This is just this is actually a diagram that shows the topics of sustainability, social values, and ecology, and they're all running through. So the economic discussions are first, and everything runs through it. And over time, it looks like sustainability ideas and concepts are actually becoming a proxy for the ideas of growth. That's why we believe. So this is work that I did with a former grad student of mine, Rafael Lobo, who's now at Duke, at the Duke Marine Lab. We think that there's this invisible regime governing the oceans, and it's not, it's just about growth. We have all these other different ideas and institutions that say that's not what, how we're going to govern the oceans. But I think in real terms, this is what's actually happening. I know that's controversial and maybe in this context, but I look forward to hearing your responses. And that's it.
Great, thank you so much, Peter. This was another excellent presentation identifying more of the challenges facing fisheries and marine biodiversity, some of the political, social, and other issues that come up when you have shared resources. As I noted with Richard's presentation, we're going to save all of the questions until the end of the panel. So same thing for our attendees. If you would like to ask Peter a question, please type it into the question or chat section on the side of your screen, and we will save those questions for him. Thank you so much, Peter. Cam is an associate professor with the Faculty of Law at the University of Alberta. He focuses his work on international and domestic environmental law, oceans law and policy, wildlife conservation, and tort law. He is the author and editor of many publications as well. He previously worked at the Health Law Institute and was a lawyer with the Edmonton firm of Field LLP. Dr. Jeffries is going to speak to us about Canada, United States Southern Resident Killer Whale Conservation. Thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, no problem. And I'd like to echo everyone's comments to just say thanks very much to Aaron and Roy and the technical crew for making this possible. So the topic of my discussion today is going to be on kind of new forms of cooperation for the conservation of the southern resident killer whales. But before I jump into that, I want to say that this is the view from my front window this morning. So perhaps I am lamenting the loss of the Florida visit the most. But also this view has helped the self-isolation process move quite easily here, where we're still hunkered down with a late push to winter. So I hope everyone else is doing okay, even where you have more balmy climates. So I guess in brief, this is what I plan to present today. I'm not sure if everyone's familiar with the southern resident killer whales. Probably those of us in North America have followed the story of their kind of recent decline with some interest, and I'm sure that some of the stories have made international headlines as well. But I'm going to give some brief comments on their conservation status and some of the shortcomings of their critical habitat. And then I'm going to look at an article that kind of is something that permeates through my research, and that's Article 65 of UNCLOS, and the international obligation or obligations that it triggers, and how we can kind of reconcile the obligations contained therein with some of the actions that Canada and the US maybe aren't taking. And then also I'll explore some of the novel forms of cooperation that have sprung up over the last 2 or 3 years between DFO and NOAA, and then consider whether or not there's an institutional form that could be taken to help aid the conservation of these marine mammals. So personally, and unfortunately, I think this presentation so far asks more questions than it provides answers. This is kind of the soft launch of what I'm hoping is going to be the next 2 to 3 years of the focus of my research on kind of a detailed study of Canada's failing approach to whale conservation on all 3 coasts, and something that is coming into quite sharp contrast recently. And that's inevitably going to engage questions of US-Canada cooperation and interaction. And so I think some of the questions I'm asking today will inform that research going forward and build off of the last couple of years of my research, which have really focused on marine protected areas, UNCLOS obligations, and ecosystem-based management. And then I think also what interests me about this kind of area is, can this novel form of cooperation engage the creation of North America's first transboundary marine protected area, something that we are lagging a little bit in compared to maybe the European context. And I think there are some interesting questions about what form that could take and what benefits it could ultimately achieve. So quickly, just to bring everyone up to the same pace on the southern resident killer whales. So these are the large dolphin population off of, or primarily off of Washington State and British Columbia. The population currently, and I think this is even outdated because there's another whale or another dolphin that's missing. So there's probably about 73 currently accounted for in the population. That's a historic low since the 1970s, when 45 to 47 adults were removed from the population, the wild population, for the aquarium trade. And the southern resident killer whales, like all marine mammals right now, are really facing a multi-headed beast, so of conservation troubles. So there's habitat degradation, environmental pollution, including noise pollution and the degradation of their acoustic environment, and reduced prey availability being a big one too. Their primary staple prey being the Chinook salmon, which is has also experienced some recent declines and should be registered as an endangered species in both jurisdictions, but isn't for a variety of political and social reasons. And then in Canada, we're also seeing quite a focus on the southern resident killer whales because there's a controversial pipeline project, the Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion, meant to connect the bitumen oil sand reserves out to the port facilities in Burnaby. And the real environmental impact of that is going to be with the tanker traffic increases and the size of the tankers and the frequency of the tankers that are proposed for use, and then the further degradation of the acoustic environment. So this has really taken on some national interests as well. And we're at a critical moment for the southern resident killer whale population. I mean, the numbers are low, and a healthy population would probably be up in the high hundreds. But what's really critical is how the fitness of the animals that are still around has decreased, as has the marginal birth rate. So they're simply not having successful births from this population. And people might remember a couple summers ago, there was the story of the mother orca that carried her baby orca for 8 weeks, mourning its death. And so there's been some interesting points of conservation that have come out of that. Some talking points, some interest from the media, etc. So in terms of their protection, the southern resident killer whales, which in their summering months occupy this area called the Salish Sea, the shared waters between Washington State and BC, so Canada and the US. They've been endangered under Canadian species at risk legislation since 2001. And the government here acknowledged that they were critically endangered in 2018, meaning they faced an imminent threat of extinction. In the US, they've been registered as endangered under the Endangered Species Act since 2005. So both countries have struggled to meaningfully protect them, and both countries have struggled, I think, especially in trying to protect their critical habitat, which is a requirement under both jurisdictions' endangered species legislation. So there's a couple of points worth noting. Here's the critical habitat that's been identified in the Salish Sea, so on the right side of the screen. And that's an incomplete picture, really, of the critical habitat that exists, because that's only their summering habitat. Now, in their wintering habitat, when they're going further afield to find Chinook salmon and other prey items, they move all the way up to northern British Columbia and the waters of Haida Gwaii, and then as far south as Monterey Bay, California. And those areas are currently excluded from critical habitat designation. And there's currently a petition where the Center for Biological Diversity has requested critical habitat extension down along the Oregon and California coast as well. So we're starting to see some traction take shape there. But another problem for this critical habitat process is, even if it is identified, and even if it does get a base level of legal protection, what does that legal protection actually look like? And a great example of this is the Species at Risk Act, so Canada's endangered species legislation. The protection that it gets is, under the federal legislation, there's a requirement that it be legally protected, and that legal protection has to guard against destruction. Okay, so for terrestrial animals, there's been some jurisprudence on what that means, what actual destruction of critical habitat like a nesting site or important mating grounds looks like. But for marine animals or aquatic animals more generally, there is no standard for what destruction looks like. And I think that a lot of people would argue that we've already passed the thresholds for certain indicia, like acoustic viability or pollution loading in the area for destruction, but that's not the approach that the governments have taken, and there's been no litigation to date on that because of the discretion that is allowed under the legislation. So critical habitat is kind of the purpose or the approach of these domestic pieces of legislation, but they have obvious shortcomings. And I think that if you take a look at this critical habitat designation on the right side, you'll see just the level of sharing, right, between the US and the Canadian waters, where there are disparate approaches that are being taken and actions that aren't really harmonized or consonant with each other. And so that creates challenges for protecting the species throughout their range and throughout their kind of cyclical patterns during the course of a year. So my favorite article of the Law of the Sea, I think, is one that bears a little bit of consideration in this context as well, and that is what exactly or what forms of cooperation can we look for under international agreements to try and drive this forward a little bit. So Article 65, which was obviously negotiated in a certain climate of great whale conservation, does obligate states to cooperate with a view to marine mammals and has a heightened lex specialis regime compared to the EEZ approach generally for cetaceans, which obligates states to work through the appropriate international organizations for their conservation management and study. So there's some interesting language in there. The general obligation for cooperation, which occurs throughout UNCLOS and a lot of international environmental treaties, but then this unique idea of working through appropriate international organizations for cetaceans. And now obviously that's not just the great whales, that includes dolphin species and other cetacean species, including the southern resident killer whales, and could drive forward conservation in this area. So is that something that binds the countries that are involved in this sort of an approach? And for Canada, the question's quite easy because we've ratified UNCLOS for 15 years or so, and so this is something that binds us. And then obviously the states as a kind of one of those famous holdouts from the Law of the Sea regime, this arguably binds them as well as reflective of customary international law. And you know, there's divergent state practice on the conservation of cetaceans, but there's some interesting language from President Clinton's administration where he presented to Congress an argument regarding Canada's bowhead whale hunt in the late 1990s that was occurring outside of the International Whaling Commission, that they were arguably bound by Article 65 and weren't following that, and that the US was bound as well, as this article reflected customary international law. So I think there's a prima facie case to make that this does bind both states. Now, what international organizations might qualify, right? If countries have to work through these organizations, what might qualify? You know, that base level of cooperation, but then something additional. Now, the UN has considered this, and it's the IWC, the FAO, and UNEP that probably qualify on the face of things, but then other organizations might qualify as well, and there's room to look for different forms of cooperation or approaches to coordinated management that I think we could fit in here as well. And so the question becomes, is there something in the North American context where we could have a forum for cooperation that makes sense? And I think that's an interesting area to consider. So we have seen renewed forms of cooperation for southern resident killer whales over the last couple of years. And I just picked two examples here that are relevant to the species conservation that are different than what we might normally see through bilateral negotiation or institutionalized cooperation, let's say. So the first is something that happened in the summer of 2018, where NOAA led efforts to treat and feed one of the ailing whales. So J50, also named Scarlet, was observed to be emaciated and likely experiencing various forms of infection. Her tissue was tested and her feces were tested, and they were found to contain evidence of parasitic worms and infection. And so NOAA partnered with a variety of organizations, including Canada's Department of Fisheries and Oceans, and then a First Nations group from Washington State and a couple aquarium organizations that have wildlife rehabilitation programs to track and then treat J50 in the wild. So an interesting kind of ex situ conservation initiative in kind of an in situ experience. And so here's an example, or here's a picture on the right of one of the treatments that was being administered to the whale in American waters. And then when the whale was up in Canadian waters, DFO was taking over trying to monitor and observe her progress. So she ultimately didn't make it, and this was one, I think, took the population down to 75 at that time of year. But it was kind of a novel form of cooperation between these organizations or agencies to try and move some sort of action forward. And then a second is recent renegotiation of Chapter 3, so the Chinook salmon provisions of Annex 4 in the Pacific Salmon Treaty. And so this is obviously a bit of a contentious agreement historically between Canada and the US, but it's of note that during the renegotiation of the Chinook salmon approach, the countries both agreed that they would reduce their catches of Chinook salmon to take into account the impact that reduced prey abundance was having on the southern resident killer whales. So we're seeing some cooperation happening in a different institutional forum, and there the negotiation was led by the Commission itself, as opposed to from a position that was advanced by either the US or Canada for the Chinook salmon. So an interesting form of cooperation happening not in a wildlife conservation agreement, but rather in a fisheries agreement on utilization of a shared stock. So some interesting kind of approaches to cooperation that were occurring or taking off. So could the next form of cooperative action take place as the designation or understanding of a transboundary marine protected area? Well, the logical starting point would be those shared waters in the Salish Sea that are the primary summering grounds for the southern resident killer whales. Now, Canada and the US don't have an experience of establishing something like this, but we both do have relatively recent policy guidance on the approaches that the countries are taking for networked marine protected areas moving forward. And comparing the documents, there's some similarities that I think are worth noting. So both obviously espouse the virtues of networking MPAs based on ecological principles and the goals of fishery recovery, species migration, coordinated vessel traffic conditions, and enabling adaptive management and ecosystem resilience. So the right language is there for trying to establish networks of MPAs domestically or even internationally. And additionally, both documents speak to the need for shared governance and potential co-management, be it with First Nations organizations or potentially even interstate cooperative mechanisms. And so both also speak to the fact that there is value in participating in international networks of MPA cooperation, and that might be participating in things that are happening in other areas of the world, which seems to be emphasized in the American framework. But from the Canadian framework, there seems to be a bit more language that speaks to partnering with North American jurisdictions and specifically the US to try and move this forward. And so both contemplate the need to increase MPA development and implementation, and the countries, while implementation has kind of lagged and enforcement has lagged, there has been some significant progress in moving towards the Aichi targets In Canada, for example, in the last 10 years has moved from 0.1% ocean MPA designation to 6.5 or 7%. So there is some motivation at least to make some of this happen. So again, and to reemphasize the kind of the driver here, there aren't any transboundary MPAs in the North American context, or at least that I could find, building off of a 2018 study that explored the absence of these. And could this be a logical starting point to re-engage those discussions, or to look at the forms of coordination of conservation measures that could move us towards that? Well, the benefits, I think, are clear if you look at driving this sort of proposal forward. There's a possibility of an expansion that captures ecosystem level requirements for the whales. There's the possibility of coordinating and harmonizing fishery and vessel-related conservation measures, which is something that's happening relatively siloed, and in a way that Canada actually has generally lagged behind the United States for this. This would be a source of introducing new protections for southern resident killer whale critical habitat. All right, so instead of saying, here's critical habitat, you can't destroy it, instead, let's say, how can we meaningfully protect critical habitat by creating new conservation measures that are harmonized, that operate through some of the shared critical habitat that moves to actually provide some positive obligations on what the regulators are meant to achieve and implement. And finally, this is an opportunity for precedent-setting action that could spur further coordinated action, and I think this is especially ripe for investigation in the Arctic and in the Beaufort Sea, in particular in areas where there are opportunities for shared management going forward. Now, if we can't look at marine examples in the Canadian American context for this, can we find sources of inspiration elsewhere to try and drive this idea forward, or to strengthen the case that this could be reasonable or feasible? And I think we do have some examples that we can look to both in North America and then abroad to try and move this forward. And in the North American context and in the freshwater management context, we have the longstanding Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement that has some ecosystem and fisheries implications that we can look to for co-management as a source of inspiration for this. And then less officially, but also interesting, we could look to the Yukon to Yellowstone, or Yellowstone to Yukon, depending on which way you're approaching it, initiative that's happened trying to connect the ecosystems along the Rocky Mountains between the jurisdictions, which has had some significant successes over the last decade, although a lot of that has occurred informally with the work and assistance of many NGOs in that area. Or we could look further afield to areas that have coordinated and implemented transboundary MPAs, right? The example that always pops to mind is the Pelagos Marine Mammal Sanctuary, which serves areas of the Mediterranean Sea. And so you could look at the institutional framework for that, the arrangement through treaty, and then efforts at coordination and implementation. So that's kind of the approach that we could go. But coming back to Article 65, is there an institution that is positioned to allow the parties to work, right, to work through to try and drive this proposal forward? Now, the one institution that comes to mind is the Commission for Environmental Cooperation, which exists pursuant to the North American Agreement on Environmental Cooperation that has been in place since 1994. Now, the benefit is this is an organization that has done cooperative studies on marine protected areas and unique issues in marine protected areas that are relevant to both countries, but the problem is it lacks the authority to designate or administer protected areas. So it studies and it can make recommendations or reports, but that's as far as it goes. But perhaps this could be the sort of initiative that gets some legitimacy or some backing or momentum from the sort of approach that could be taken there. Now, obviously, this is an end goal. This would be a kind of a best case scenario if we actually had something like this occur. I think experience to date has suggested that the political will is there at the state level, or provincial level to try and improve conditions for the southern resident killer whales. But federally, there hasn't been as much uptake of this either on the Canadian side or the American side. And so whether or not this is something that could actually come out of, the Canadian Oceans Act or the American sanctuaries approach is a difficult question to answer. And then whether there'd be the will to implement it, I think, is another question that we have unanswered. But those are things I'd love to explore with you in the question period. And I see that I've gone just a couple of minutes over, as is usually the case when I get talking about whales. So I'll leave it there, and I'll thanks very much for listening, and I look forward to picking up a discussion at the end.
Thank you so much, Cam. It was a really interesting example of, I think, the need for transboundary cooperation in the context of a particular species, and some of the challenges, but opportunities that exist for that type of transboundary cooperation. So I look forward to chatting about that more during the Q&A session at the end. And if you are watching this webinar and you just joined us, if you have questions for Cam, please type those in the chat or the questions section, and we will get to those after our panelists have all concluded their presentations. Thank you so much, Cam.
Thanks, guys.
Our next presentation is by Professor Blaise Pascal Tiru Minyewa Mahigo, who works at the Faculty of Law at the University of Kinshasa. He is an associate professor there. He is doing postdoctoral work in the Faculty of Political Sciences and Law at the University of Quebec at Montreal. He is also a visiting professor at Ghent University in Belgium and is a member of the World Commission of Environmental Law at the IUCN in the Climate Change Specialist Group and of the Quebec Society of International Law. He is going to talk to us about transforming the conservation of aquatic biodiversity in the Democratic Republic of Congo. So I think this will be another really interesting case study.
So thank you very much, Erin, for the flow, and I thank all the attendees, and I thank again all the organizers of this conference. I'm honored today to talk to you about my research on the transformation of the conservation of aquatic biodiversity in Democratic Republic of Congo. I will try my best to present this research, which is a bit huge, in 15 minutes. So essentially, my research has 4 parts. First, before starting, I want to know if, can you see my screen?
We can see your screen. You just need to start the presentation so that it will go full screen for us.
You see the PPT. Okay, that's great.
There, that's perfect right there.
Okay. So I'm saying that my presentation has 4 main parts. The first part will be on the aquatic biodiversity in the Democratic Republic of Congo. I'll present you the rich and unique and exceptional biodiversity of this country. And secondly, I will talk about the management of aquatic biodiversity and fishing in the DRC. I will highlight problems and challenges of this sector. After that, I will provide insights on the analysis of the aquatic biodiversity and fishing laws from the domestic level to the international level. I will end lastly with recommendation to achieve sustainable fishing and sustainable management of the aquatic biodiversity in Democratic Republic of Congo. So lakes and river and marine water cover 3 to 3.5% of the entire area of Congo, equivalent to more than 86,000 kilometers square, with a potential of more than 700,000 tons of fishes and a coastal line of 170 kilometers. Congo is one of the rare states in the world to home an exceptional high diversity of freshwater fish. The states owns the fishiest lake of Africa and the world's longest freshwater, the Lake Tanganyika. As you can see, this is the water plane of the DRC, which describes several lakes and rivers which cross this country, and it provides also information on their areas. What about the management of aquatic biodiversity and fishing in the Congo? Three ministries are sharing the management of aquatic biodiversity. First of all, the Ministry of Fishing and Livestock is in charge of fishing, and then the conservation of aquatic biodiversity and the protection of water ecosystem are respectively managed by the Ministry of Environment and the Ministry of Energy. Their mission somehow overlaps as the delineation of the responsibility is unclear. In 2016, the annual production of fishing sector was about 86,000 tons, and in 2019, the Ministry of Fishing and Livestock support that 250,000 tons of fishery products was produced, and the country imports 220,000 fishery products. For this minister, fishing is still largely underexploited and can contribute more to the economy of the DRC. But in this sector, we find 12 industrial fishing companies and 4,000 fishermen, which produce nearly 21,000 tons and 13,000 tons of fishes in 2014. But three main organizations, FAO, UNEP, and the Ministry of Environment, state that the fishing sector in Congo is unregulated, unplanned, and unsustainable, as it can endanger the aquatic species. So here you can find tables on the production of fisheries in Congo, and you can see directly that catching are more important than aquaculture. Why those institutions, UNEP, FAO, are right to say that the fishing in Congo are unregulated, unplanned, and unsustainable? Let us see the main cause and the root causes of this situation. An obsolete fishing legislation, fishing quotas are not established. The lack of financial means and insufficient qualified staff, lack of information on the stock of fish, the using of inappropriate fishing methods, few specialists in fisheries, inadequate fishing management system, deforestation, pollution due to mining are some of the causes that affect negatively fishing and the protection of aquatic biodiversity in Congo. In this picture, you can see the Lake Tanganyika and Wagenya. Wagenya are one of the tribe and the place where they do fisher. This tribe is well known for is a well-known fisherman tribes. So what about the law? Aquatic biodiversity and fishing laws in Congo. It's no longer visible. Please, Erin, can you see the screen? Hello.
Yes, we can still hear you and see your screen, but it looks like we lost the video.
Okay, let me.
There you go.
It's fine.
It's fine.
You can see also the PPT?
Yes.
Okay. So what about the law aquatic fishing and the protection of aquatic biodiversity. This year, particularly, the Congo will celebrate its 16 years of independence. However, however, the the main decrease on fishing have been adopted 80 years ago. This decree referred to the colonial authorities as implementing institution. This decree don't establish fishing methods, fishing quotas, fishing periods. They don't take into account the pollution of aquatic biodiversity. They don't regulate the introduction of invasive species, and they don't regulate overfishing. So as you can remark, it was 80 years ago. This decree was adopted very before the development of international biodiversity and environmental law, before the introduction of many concepts, principles, and approach which promotes sustainable fishing and sustainable management of aquatic biodiversity. This means that this legislation, this main fishing legislation, is out of the context. In 1969, the DRC has adopted its first legislation on the conservation of nature. In, After that, many years ago, in 2014, we replaced this legislation by adopting a new one, a law on conservation of nature. This law regulates the protection of aquatic biodiversity as the law of environment and the water law do. Okay, you can see that there is a progress. The progress has been made as now they recognize the protection of aquatic biodiversity against pollution. And in that laws, particularly in the water law in Article 67, they designate three ministries to lead the protection of aquatic biodiversity and fishing. However, the enforcement of this law faces many challenges. So it's quite sure that fishing is still badly regulated, as the main decree on fishing is very old and out of the actual modern context. Something is very interesting. In 1985, the FAO has drafted a bill on the marine and continental fishing. However, there is nothing happened after this drafting. In 2010, there is a bill of fishing on fishing was submitted in the parliament, but till now the country doesn't have a new fishing law. What about the regional level? At the regional level, both conventions are very interesting, the Bamako Convention and the Maputo Convention. The first convention protects aquatic biodiversity against hazardous wastes. This convention is signed by Congo and are facing challenges to be implemented since till now we just have this year in February there was the third conference of party. This is kind of process to make it well established, well implemented. The same with the Maputo Convention. The Maputo Convention particularly is very interesting because it promotes the conservation of species within the framework of sustainable development. The Article 3 of this convention lists the prohibited means of taking traps. Poison, gassing, and smoking out are prohibited. So, however, the same problem with the Bamako, but here is more far to be implemented. As you can know, this convention will enter in force in 2016, and they still have many steps before putting in force. At the international level, we have numerous soft and hard laws on fishing and conservation of aquatic biodiversity. The most important is the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. the DRC ratified this convention in 1989. And also, there are the UN Agreement on Fish Stock of 1995, which provides very interesting provision on sustainable fishing and sustainable management of aquatic biodiversity, especially in these Article 6 and 7. There are also two United Nations General Assembly resolution and the Roma Declaration on illegal, unreported, and unregulating fishing, which encourage the ratification of the agreement. However, the DRC and many African countries didn't ratify the 1995 agreement, which implements the United Nations Convention on Law of the Sea. Moreover, the DRC has ratified the Convention on Biodiversity, on Biological Diversity, which regulates the protection of aquatic, aquatic biodiversity, and encourage parties to implement ecosystem approach, precautionary principle, and to respect the goal B and Objective 6 of the Strategic Plan of Biological Diversity. However, the DRC is swimming out of this very interesting, favorable framework that focus on sustainable fishing and sustainable management of aquatic biodiversity. Why the DRC is missing? The question is, why the DRC is missing this great opportunity to implement these very interesting hard and soft laws? What is needed for the DRC to grasp it and how to make it possible? We state that there is a lack of political will and precondition to grasp this opportunity. Some of these preconditions are the promotion of research to get reliable data on stock fishes, on type of species, and sustainable fishing methods, quotas, season, and to develop a local expertise. Another precondition is to build capacity of public institutions on the management of fishing and to increase the awareness of fishermen and fisher companies on sustainable fishing. The third recommendation is to establish an effective management fishing system in order to control fishing activity, to elaborate plans, policy, and strategy based on scientific data, to enforce suitable international and domestic laws on the protection of aquatic biodiversity and fishing, to encourage the participation of stakeholders in the elaboration and implementation of plan and politics on fishing. The fifth recommendation is about infrastructure. We need infrastructure. We need to renovate infrastructure, to build infrastructure in order to provide equipment to facilitate an efficient work. And the sixth recommendation is linked to the environmental issues. We need to deal with environmental issues as pollution, as degradation. And the last one, the very last one, is about the law. We need to transform, the DRC needs to transform the domestic laws by adopting and enforcing a new fishing law in which precautionary principle, ecosystem approach, sustainable development, and interesting provision on sustainable fishing promoted by soft laws, international soft law, and hard law, has UNCLOS and CDB, CDG 14. We need again to ensure an effective implementation of water and environment and nature conservation laws in order to better protect aquatic biodiversity. At the regional level, the DRC should seriously implement Maputo Convention, which is very interesting in African level, as it provides many provisions to protect and push countries to adopt fishing laws. At the international level, I think it's very interesting if the DRC can ratify the 1995 agreements on which promotes the implementation of very interesting provision of the the United Nations Convention of the Law of the Sea. So I think there are other recommendations. This list is not exhaustive, but I say many thanks to all of you who attend this online conference, and I hope it was interesting. I'm expecting your comments and questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Blaise Pascal. That really was interesting. You shed a lot of light on the challenges faced by the DRC, but I think something that you did really well that all of our speakers so far has done is you've identified a lot of potential solutions. So it's not all doom and gloom. There is hope, and so hopefully together we can start to try to figure out ways to address some of these issues. So thank you so much for your presentation. At this time, I'd like to ask all of the panelists from this panel to turn on your audio and your video, and we will try to go through some of the questions that have been asked. I think the only person we're missing is Cam. There we go. Excellent. All right. So we received a question early on from Ari, and Ari, I'm wondering if you're still on, if you would like to unmute yourself and ask Richard a question. And if not, I'll ask it for you. There he is.
Yeah, I'm on. Just yeah, fantastic talk, all of you, but the question is for Richard. Could you comment on the relationship between fisheries agreements on the one hand and biodiversity agreements on the other hand? So, for instance, the Convention on Migratory Species and subsidiary instruments for example, albatrosses. So does change increase the need for synergies?
Richard, really quickly before you answer that, could all of the other panelists just mute your microphones until we have a question for you? Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much, Ari. And talking about things going on in the background, my wife's actually teaching a Pilates class in the other room, so if you're picking up some interesting feedback, then your downward dog needs some work. So Ari, great question. Thanks for that. And the short answer is yes, there will need to be greater degrees of interaction, I think, as fisheries move into different areas and are more likely to then move into areas in which there's an elevated scope for bycatches, for instance. I think there's been some interesting trends in how they do interact. I think the first trend is that it's largely driven by the biodiversity agreements. They're the ones that are really pushing for the collaborative arrangements with the RFMOs, rather than it being the other way around. I think there are a couple of reasons for that. And firstly, I think that fisheries interests are often marginalized within the biodiversity structures. And there's a lot of concern among the fishing communities about using biodiversity structures that in a way that could potentially undermine them. And I'm thinking particularly about some of the efforts in CITES to list some of the species that are quite commercially valuable and then put brakes on the trade. I think looking at the CMS, which is actually a really good starting point for this. ACAP has been absolutely terrific, the agreement on conservation of albatrosses and petrels. So they've established a seabird bycatch working group that actually has an RFMO engagement strategy, and it's worked with 9 different RFMOs on that, and it's been quite helpful in making sure that long-lining issues and seabird bycatches have been front and center in the deliberations in a way that probably wouldn't have happened otherwise. I think there's a lot of lip service to bycatches in a lot of different RFMOs, and without that nudge, I think that can be quite a problematic issue. The only problem with that is that this requires an awful lot of work. So if you're simultaneously spinning plates of 9 different RFMOs, as ACAP is, then that does put a drain on resources, and it does require people to be attending meetings and in the room, and so that's where it is an operative priority for the agreement, such as it is in ACAP, as being pretty much the leading cause of mortality for the seabirds. Then it's worth the investment. But you can see in some other conservation agreements where engagements, some of the states that are parties to this and are responsible for funding these agreements get quite tetchy when agreements then try to reach out towards each other. So yes, all synergies, great synergy, I think, in many key respects, and I think we will be seeing more of this from certainly a lot of the biodiversity organizations as they see fisheries starting to move within their respective areas of jurisdiction, I think.
Thank you. Roy, I think you had wanted to follow up on Ari's question. Would you like to join the conversation, and then we can move on to some of our questions for the other panelists?
Sure. Sure. I just wanted to note on the issue of synergies that UNEP actually did come out with something on understanding synergies and mainstreaming among the biodiversity related conventions. I had a piece in there with Anya Grobitsky from the Ramsar perspective, and there's a good example of synergies across MEAs with respect to highly pathogenic avian influenza H5N1 back in the 2005-2008 timeframe, when Ramsar, CBD, CMS, and the African Eurasian Waterbirds Agreement collaborated on guidance to respond to H5N1. So that's a positive example, but we also found that synergies, at least among the scientific bodies of the MEAs, require support and a commitment of resources that is often not forthcoming. So that can be one challenge. But thanks to everybody for some great presentations. It's a great panel. Thanks.
Thank you. Volker Mauerhofer, I believe you had a question for Peter. If you're still on the webinar, would you like to unmute yourself and ask Peter? We can see you, we can't hear you yet.
So hello everybody, thanks for the wonderful presentations. I had actually questions for Richard and for Peter, and I make it short. To Richard, are if some of those species which are wandering to the north could be considered also invasive alien species at some time, what legal consequences could that have be? And to Peter, how do you see the role of the tourism industry, the whale watching tourism industry in this context which you presented? Thank you.
Tourism?
There's a whale watching tourism industry quite lively around Vancouver. Actually, I was twice on that boat and I never saw the southern whales.
Oh no.
That's a question.
Sorry. Was my question to
Cam?
Oh, that was the question for Cam. So I'm mixing up my questions already.
That's okay.
I have to think about what the question was for Peter, because I don't see my question anymore up there.
Well, let's get the answers to these two, and then I can look back and find your question for Peter. So, Richard, would you like to respond briefly?
course. Thanks, Aaron. Great question. Hi, Volker. Nice to see you again. And typically incisive question there. So this is quite a tricky issue, and it does give rise to some really intriguing legal problems. So on the one hand, there are a couple of very high-profile legal regimes that have taken quite a sympathetic approach to climate shifts. So, for instance, the CMS has reformulated its concept of favorable conservation status recently with the exact phrase is climate-induced range shifts in mind. And the EU's invasive species regulation also exempts species that have been moved into other areas as a result of natural activities and issues such as ecological changes and climate change. So in some parts of the legislation that's been quite sympathetic. It does throw some really interesting legal questions up, and in the context of fish, just a very quick insight to a project that I did with Ari and Eric Molinar and when I was in Utrecht. We were asked to look at the possibility of reintroducing bluefin tuna into British waters. And I was looking at the British law on this, and of course with the devolution package, Scotland, England, Wales and Northern Ireland have different legal systems, and they had different concepts of a native species. So in some jurisdictions there is a cutoff point for native species, so once they've no longer been part of that ecosystem, they then get reclassified as invasive, whereas some go back and consider these as in perpetuity. And the interesting thing was that Scotland considered the bluefin tuna had been so far removed from Scottish waters that it would now be an invasive species, but England considered it was still a native species. So there's going to be some intriguing legal questions about when a species loses its native status and when it regains it. And I think one of the problem is that we base our understanding of a lot of wildlife law on historical ranges and this sort of thing, without really giving a baseline as to what historical means and how far back in the past we intend to go. But yeah, great question, and certainly I think a lot of research can spiral off into this particular area.
Thank you, Richard, and thank you, Volker. Now I'll turn it over to Cam to respond to Volker's question about whale watching.
Hi, Volker. Thanks. Good question. So the interesting, I guess, short answer is that Canada has kind of followed Washington State in terms of setting new regulations for the whale watching distances for the southern resident killer whales. So in Canada, the regulation up until last year was that you could get within 100 meters on all sides of the southern resident killer whales. And America, so the governor in Washington State put some pressure for new restrictions, and there you cannot get within 400 yards now, or meters, either in front or behind the southern residents, or 300 yards to either side. So they've increased the distance that you're allowed to approach or maintain. And then also now in Canada, we followed suit last year and made it 400 meters on all sides of the southern resident killer whales. So I guess at the moment it's a little bit stricter. Now enforcement's not great for that sort of activity. If you said you bid out on the whale watching boats, as have I, and I've talked to some of the operators, and there's some discrepancies on what you can do. So when you get close, some will cut the engine and allow to drift with the whales and get closer that way. Some will stop at a certain point in time and cut the engine and allow the whales to approach them. So there's definitely some roundabouts that have been taken with respect to that. Other laws that are coming in that will impact the whale watchers are going to be the speed restrictions. So there's a 7-knot restriction that's a law in the US for operating a vessel within 1/2 mile from the orca. And in Canada, there's a guideline which is under 7 knots within 1 kilometer, or 1,000 meters. So we've moved now from not only distances, but also speed requirements and engine noise and things like that. But it's definitely a highly profitable industry out on the West Coast, both for you know, in Vancouver Island, and then down in Washington State, and in the summering months in the Salish Sea. So that's where a lot of this is occurring. So there'll probably be future developments, but there has been additional action for the orca compared to most other marine mammal watching, where you're still allowed to get within 100 meters.
What about the protected area? Could there be allies when it comes to the protected area? Not only animals to the whales.
Yeah, definitely. So if you set up a protected area, I think that you could look at standalone regulations for activity within the area, or you could try and harmonize amongst industries. So you could have areas that could be off limits for whale watchers. You could have geographical boundaries, GPS coordinates set in that way to try and limit it, or there could be restrictions on the number of boats that are able to participate, or the frequency, which is also an issue. So you don't just have a conveyor belt of boat after boat after boat visiting the same pod, you know, during the operating hours. So yeah, you could definitely put those as standalone requirements, coordinating or harmonizing the different approaches on either side.
Great, thank you, Volker. Before we go back to the question for Peter, Richard, I believe you had a question for Cam that I think would be relevant for him to answer at this point. Would you like to ask him your question?
Sure,
panelist
so friendly fire then, Cam. There it is, yeah. Yeah, I was going to ask you, Cam, were there any examples of, you give some of the examples of the transboundary cooperation in the, between US and Canada. And I love this, the Article 65 geek out, which is awesome. I was wondering if there were any instances of good practice or innovative practice, or indeed shortcomings, that might give sort of useful lessons for any sort of potential transboundary NPA activity there.
So I mean, I think that there are, so if we're talking just the American-Canadian experience, I mean, I think you could jump into some of the problems with fisheries co-management. Like I think that you could focus on the Pacific salmon, and I know I highlighted that as an example of some cooperation, but I think you could also use that as an example of uncooperative behavior. So that would be a suitable example for failed cooperation in that region. And then I think if, so we don't have that kind of co-management MPA experience to draw on in the North American kind of context. But if we wanted to, you know, I think it's easy to look at the Pelago Sanctuary and draw from the European experience, or maybe even some of the OSPAR high seas MPAs, and say, these are the strengths, these are the weaknesses. And I think in particular, what would be useful in looking at something for the Salish Sea is that's a highly exploited area. So you have so much marine traffic that's coming through that, and then so much intense fishery activity that aggregates seasonally. And so I think there would be some useful shortcomings to look at also areas of, say, the Mediterranean that are highly exploited, highly utilized by different types of shipping and recreational practices, and then say, can we learn from those in a way that can establish something that's really meaningful? And I think what would be great, and I know this resonates really well from the Canadian perspective, and I think from my initial, you know, I'm harkening back to my master's and my time spent in Virginia, but what could resonate also for the American perspective is, how do we give critical habitat some teeth? Like, how, from the North American perspective, that's such a shortcoming of our endangered species protection, is this idea of critical habitat that gets a legal designation but doesn't have the sort of conservation measures that we'd like to see. And I think even something that was beyond notional but was possible and pragmatic as a protected area with harmonized requirements aggregated in one spot to try and move this forward would be a real win for the species, to open up different conservation possibilities, not only in that highly exploited area, but in other areas like the Arctic, which are going to open up to expanded utilization. And then also like the straits versus internal waters debate, right? In the Arctic would be something where we could look to Canadian-American state practice diverging along the law of the sea. So I think there's lots of examples, and unfortunately, I think many of them would suggest tension as opposed to solution. But there's such strong advocacy that's happening from the provincial and state authorities that I think that could help drive some of this forward. It's a great question.
It's a great answer. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Richard, for the question. I found Volker's question for Peter. Peter, you had, I believe, showed a graph showing the sort of plateau of the global fish catch over time.
Yeah.
Yeah, the question was
to know
actually,
about. Oh,
I remember the question. I remember the question. These are usually those graphs with fishery or exploitation, and I wonder how the profits, if you have any numbers, how the profits developed in this connection, because that there's more exploited, it means you exploit more, but it doesn't show if you pay off your bill, yeah? If you invest perhaps more than you exploit, yeah? In terms of financial gains. Do you have any data about the profits?
So there was a 2010 PNAS article that didn't really answer that question, but showed statistically that profit drove growth in fish effort. And the irony is that there's actually less, revenue available because of the overexploited stocks. But in feeding that problem, the fishers are going to compete against each other even when there's not enough. So they're going to continue to push hard. The irony of when you find yourself in a race to use a resource is that people fish harder, not less, and they make less money. One thing I kind of rushed through the talk, but one thing that is worth noting is that the effort that we're putting out to fish globally is 10 times what we had in 1950, and we're getting half the fish per effort. So that's a real red flag for an equilibrium. That's a really important indication that destabilization is the next step.
It's typical fish tanks game, actually, what we see.
Yeah, one thing too is that we've seen from buybacks, when you want to try and take out some of the boats and reduce effort, is that people just go buy better boats then. But thanks for the question, and thanks to the organizers. It's nice to do something different than just sit in my dining room. So
thank you for being part of this. We have a question for Blaise Pascal, and Richard, you're welcome to jump in and ask it, or I'm happy to read it, paraphrase it for you.
Yeah, sure, I'll do it. So thanks, Pascal. That was a really interesting overview and introduction to the DRC's system. I was wondering, you mentioned right at the start about how responsibility for fisheries is split across 3 different ministries. How well do they work together? Or do they communicate well, or is it like in a lot of jurisdictions where they don't talk to each other and they're competing with each other and jealously guard their own territories and turfs, and you end up with disjointed and dysfunctional management?
Thanks for the question. I will go straight to the point here. I have first to describe the 3 minister. When you in Congo, the 3 minister work differently, and the Ministry of Environment and Sustainable Development is the more active, more visible, and is more in charge of the protection of aquatic biodiversity. But he has 2 units which can deal also with fishing matter: the unit of natural conservation and the unit of sustainable development. At the other side, we have the Ministry of Fishing, but this ministry is really invisible, and we don't know what they are really doing. But for so there are many things to do. They miss. There is a lack of equipment. There is a lack of data, and with the new government, we know since 2010 that there is a fishing legislation which is submitted in the parliament, but there is no action, no concrete action which is doing in that sense. and at the last side, we have the Ministry of Energy, which is more focused on the distribution of water and electricity, and less than protecting aquatic biodiversity. So they work in an isolated manner. So there is no real coordination between the three. I cannot say they jealous each other or not, but the problem is just an organizational problems. So but there is opportunity for them to work together, as you can I expose in one of my slides. I talk about the water laws, the very recent laws of 2014, 15, and which is implemented since 2016, June 2016. So you can see in the Article 67, they talk about the fishing and the protection of aquatic biodiversity, and they designated the three ministers. But in the same articles, they say a decree should organize this work. But till now, there is no decree which is adopted to well regulated, well organize the coordination of those three ministries in that sector. But from my point of view, as I know how it's going in Congo, how institutions are working there, I would suggest maybe to unify those ministries, but because now we have a political problem, there is kind of the party which is in place try to split ministries to provide post or portfolio to the member of parties. But I think there is no opportunity to have so many parties. In my point of view, I think we can maybe, okay, I would say I can give the example of France, for instance, when there is the Ministry of Environment, Energy, and Water together. So for me, this could be also an opportunity to give maybe or we have another choice to give the leadership to the ministry, which is working very, very, okay, I cannot say very perfectly, but at least they are visible and they are working, the Ministry of Environment, or we just put all together, we mix the energy and water and the environment at the same in one ministry. And I think this could also contribute to push forward the work on sustainable fishing and sustainable management of aquatic biodiversity.
Brilliant. Thanks very much. Yeah.
Blaise Pascal, I have a follow-up question for you. One of your slides, and actually I think you talked about it a couple of times in your presentation, you mentioned some of the national laws that are in place, most of which, at least from the one slide, appear to be older laws. And I think you mentioned sort of the need to update those. Have there been serious efforts, or are there ongoing efforts to revise, amend some of those laws to address some of the issues that have come to light over the last several decades?
Yes, in one of my slides I put it. There is work in that direction, and the FAO is really helping a lot in that way. And also there was in the parliament there was a commission who work on to build a new law on fishing. As I say, in 1985, the FAO has provided a bill, a project of law on marine and continental fishing. And this you can also check in the FAO data. This law is according to FAO, is very complete and can help to get a sustainable fishing in the DRC and to protect wild aquatic biodiversity. But since then, there is nothing which happened in concrete. But the second proposition was done by the Commission of the Parliament. They submit the bill in 2010, but now it's 10 years ago, and there is nothing which happened. I heard that one of the ministry in the former government find that it was not important to have this kind of law. It was a ministry of livestock and fishing in that period, find it was not important to have a new law. So sometimes it's about political engagement that I say in my conclusion. There is less political will to take action and to implement, to effectively implement or taking new laws to update this our legal framework. So yeah, there are work is done, but nothing concretely. We don't have the result. The problem is the result. The process is there, but the results we're still waiting for the result, and we hope that with the new government, but till now we don't. It's almost 2 years now that we have a new president, new government, but we don't really see a clear picture and good picture about the management of aquatic biodiversity and the sustainable fishing. So it's, yeah, unfortunately. Yeah, thank you for your question.
Thank you. With that, I'm going to just check to make sure we don't have any other questions. Doesn't look like it. Attendees, if we happen to miss one of your questions, we are trying to keep track of them so that we can have the speakers follow up with you. Oh, here we have a question from Junior for Blaise Pascal. Is there any known lobbying taking place nationally or internationally for the protection of endangered species in the DRC? What about the Institute for the Conservation of Nature? Are they involved in any effort to manage the fishing industry sustainably there?
Can you read the second time? I didn't get it.
Sure. Is there any known lobbying taking place nationally for the protection of endangered species in the DRC? And then what about the Institute for the Conservation of Nature? Are they involved in any effort to manage the fishing industry there sustainably?
Yeah, yes, I can say there is a lobbying, but very little. In the environmental sector, most of the lobbying are concentrated on the protected area or climate change. But for aquatic biodiversity, I haven't seen more. Maybe international NGOs which are interested by this question. But for the ICCN, yes, normally is one of the institution which should involve in the protection of aquatic biodiversity, and is linked to the Ministry of Environment and Sustainable Development. However, their work also is not very focused on the fishing. They are more in the protection of aquatic biodiversity, but still now they do less. They are more focusing on, can I say, terrestrial fauna or protected area than the sector of aquatic biodiversity, which is a pity. I think there is kind of, yeah, many people disregard or are not really focused, maybe because they don't see the fish, they are in the water, I don't know, but they are not really taking seriously the protection of aquatic biodiversity or the fishing sector. Yeah, so that's my point.
I think that was the last of the questions from our attendees. Again, we're trying to take them down and we'll pass them on to the speakers so they can follow up with you later if we happen to miss one. Apologies. Before we close this and go on a short lunch break, I just wanted to open up the floor, I guess, the mic to our panelists to see if anyone had any closing thoughts they'd like to share with the group. No? All right, well, thank you so much. This was an amazing start in terms of the panels. Touched on a lot of really interesting, challenging issues at a variety of levels. I mean, we went local to international and back again. And I like how we sort of looked at the issues broadly, holistically, but also included some interesting case studies of how these things play out with respect to particular species or particular places. And so thank you for all of the work that you all are doing on these issues, and thank you for taking the time to present as part of the conference. We really appreciate it.